Because if you won't, then nobody will. The boy stares back at him, and the hope in James's heart flickers a little more brightly. Even just the eye contact, just being seen, gives him courage, and he starts to take a step forward. But then the man stops whistling, and James stops and glances sideways at the closed door. Doing so breaks whatever spell exists between him and the other boy. When James looks back again, he sees the boy is already ducking into the far stall, pulling the door closed, locking it. Hiding, and that last little flicker of hope inside James gutters out. The man emerges from his own toilet stall a moment later. Even after all this time, James still knows better than to look at the man's face, but he can sense the expression of triumph there right now. The man ruffles his hair as he walks past. He stops briefly outside the stall where the other boy is cowering. James walks past it afterward, dutifully following the man out, and he reaches out to the door as he does. His fingertips touch the wood so softly that the boy inside cannot possibly have heard, and yet James senses him flinching. You could have saved us, he thinks, but you didn't, and after a moment's hesitation, he takes the photograph out of his pocket and places it on the floor. So that's yours now. When they arrive back at the farm later, the man takes James to the house. A few of the chickens flutter about frantically in their cages, but the man seems indifferent. He doesn't look down the patchy yard either. Past the pens of animals to the enclosure at the far end, where the slumped shape of the boy waits in the early evening gloom, but James does. Inside the house, the man leads him through to the dirty kitchen at the back, then unlocks the heavy padlock on the door there. It opens onto a set of flimsy wooden stairs descending into absolute blackness below. James has never been down here. The man's heavy boots tap solidly on each step as he descends. James's own land more softly behind as he follows him down into this cold, dark space underneath the world. At the bottom, the air smells of mold and earth. There's a click as the man pulls on a cord. The single bulb flickers on and buzzes gently, illuminating a small, makeshift storeroom. James looks around. Every visible surface is thick with dust, and cobwebs trail down from the wooden ceiling. There are bags stuffed full of old clothes against one wall, open cardboard boxes against another, filled with an assortment of random objects, crumpled handbags, broken toys, indistinct photographs curling at the edges, souvenirs. James realizes. The wall directly ahead is lined with rusted filing cabinets. Above them are a series of handmade wooden shelves the man has nailed into the brickwork. James's gaze moves over the items there. An old kerosene lamp and a crumpled box of matches, the rusted handles of wrenches and hammers, an ornate silver picture frame with no photograph inside. Metal hooks have been screwed into the fronts of the shelves, keys hanging from them at intervals all the way along. The man opens one of the drawers. It makes a rasping, scraping sound. "Come and look," he tells James. James steps across and peers down. The first thing he notices is the money. It has been a long time since he has seen money, and there is almost too much of it here for his mind to make sense of. Hundreds of rolled-up banknotes held in tight coils with dirty rubber bands. James has no idea where the man got it from, but the implication of what he's being shown is clear. "Look at how powerful I am, how powerful I can make you be." His gaze moves to everything else in the drawer. "Take some of it out," the man tells him. "Look through it." James hesitates for a second, then reaches in and begins to pick items out at random, one by one. Passports, bank cards, birth certificates, driving licenses. The blank faces of strangers stare back at him, and the details begin to merge as he looks through them. But again, the implication is clear. The man has dark magic. He can change his name, his age, his face. There are so many identities in this room, each one a door that the man can step through, moving from one to the next at will. He is anybody and nobody. He is whoever he wishes to be. He is hurt and trauma passed on from body to body. And that is what James can be too. Nobody sees and nobody cares. The man has spent so long convincing him of that, and he's proved it to James today. But down here, finally, he is teaching him something else as well. Nobody except me. James hears the familiar tune whistled softly in the air. It takes a moment for him to realize that it's coming from him now. Oceanoff PDF, com. Part 4, Despair. Oceanoff PDF, com. 23 Michael Johnson lived in a tower block not far from the canal where Rose Saunders had moored her boat. Aside from a handful of miles at the end, in fact, the route I drove us on was almost exactly the same as I'd taken yesterday, and passing the exit for the rest area brought the same frisson of panic it had then. But it also occurred to me how close most of us had stayed to the scene of our encounter with the Pied Piper. Darren Field and Rose Saunders had both lived nearby. Michael Johnson still appeared to. Oliver Hunter had moved a little farther afield, but the stretch of canal on which he had vanished was part of the same system where Rose had made her home. And while Sarah and I had moved away, circumstances had brought the two of us back again. It was as though we were all tethered to the place by a cord that could never be broken, only stretched for a while until eventually it pulled us back. After leaving the motorway, I didn't drive directly to Johnson's address. When I estimated that we were 10 minutes away, I pulled in and parked on a residential road. "What are you doing?" Sarah said. "Nothing." I eyed the rearview mirror. When she realized what I was doing, she craned her neck and looked back over her shoulder. "You think we're being followed?" "No," I said. "I'm just being careful." Ever since the ferry, I'd had the sensation that we were being shadowed. A tingle of attention was itching between my shoulder blades. Which made sense, of course. The photograph I'd received proved that someone really had been watching me. But I hadn't noticed anything suspicious on the ferry, and I'd kept a constant eye on the traffic around us after we disembarked and drove away. There had been nothing. Even so, I was still watching carefully now, making a mental note of the color and model of the cars around us. I tried to catch glimpses of the people driving them and remember parts of the license plates. 5 minutes later, I was satisfied. "Okay," I said quietly. "Let's go." Michael Johnson had a flat in a tower block. It turned out to be one of 3, angled so that the blank windows and empty balconies 20 stories above faced each other across a forlorn spread of dirty tarmac. We parked outside Johnson's block. There were large gray bins in a wire mesh cage by the entrance, but one of them had been tipped over onto its side, and litter was skittering aimlessly across the ground in the breeze. An old set of double doors led inside, the glass there dark. Sarah leaned forward and peered up dubiously. "I'm guessing 812 means he's on the 8th floor." "Probably," I said. "The lift might be working. If not, at least we'll get our steps in." I turned the engine off, and we sat there for a few seconds in silence. Outside the car, there didn't seem to be anybody else around at all. The world was so quiet that the tower block in front of us now felt eerie and deserted. "You realize we might be doing something very stupid," Sarah said. "I've been thinking that ever since we left the house." She nodded to herself. "As long as we're on the same page." Then she leaned back and clicked her seat belt off. We walked across to the block. The entrance doors opened onto a drab corridor that led down to a claustrophobic hall, with narrow stairwells disappearing up on 3 sides. There were 2 lifts, one of them working. I pressed the call button and we waited, the half-reflection on the swirled metal of the doors turning us into a pair of distorted ghosts. The interior was small and cramped, with torn linoleum on the floor and undecipherable graffiti daubed across the misty mirror. The elevator lurched as it set off and then juddered more alarmingly with every floor we passed. "We're going to die," Sarah said. "It'll be okay. I don't want to die in a lift." We reached the 8th floor and then followed the corridor around. There was no natural light, and a number of the strips above us weren't working, so we passed through pockets of shadow. All the doors were shut, but I could hear television programs and music through the thin wood. A couple arguing, a baby crying. We reached flat 812. I knocked on the flimsy door. There was no immediate response from inside the flat, and Sarah and I shared an uneasy glance. There could have been 100 reasons why Michael Johnson wasn't home right now, and most of them were innocent. But I could tell that we were both focusing on the one that was not. Then I heard careful movement on the other side of the door. A few seconds later it opened a crack, a chain holding it in place, and a man peered out at us. Assuming this was Michael Johnson, he was only 6 or 7 years older than us, but time had not been kind to him. Even from the little I could see through the gap, his eyes were bleary and his face was pale and drawn. He was wearing a dirty, baggy t-shirt and a sagging gray beanie in which his head appeared almost lost. "Michael Johnson," I said. "Who are you?" He sounded suspicious. But I thought there was also an undertone of fear. Once again, there were many possible reasons for that, but I couldn't help imagining the worst. "My name is Daniel," I said. "This is my friend Sarah." "Are you police?" "Number, I'm a doctor. Sarah's a singer." He looked at Sarah, then back at me. "What do you want?" How would my father approach this? As far as he had taken his own investigation, I didn't imagine he would have found his way here. Michael Johnson was too common a name to pin down, and I was sure that the method Sarah had used to find this address would never have occurred to him. But if he had done, what would he say? What words would he have used to persuade a frightened man to unchain the door and talk to him? I decided to settle the matter quickly. "We're here because we want to talk about what happened to you," I said, "about what you were forced to watch." That got an immediate reaction, if not quite the one I had hoped for. The man's eyes widened in panic and he made to shut the door. but he was slower than I was, and I got there first, sliding my foot quickly into the gap. The wood was so thin that it barely hurt when the door slammed into it, and then did so again and again. "Get out," he spat at me. "Get out, leave me alone. Michael, go fucking away, get the fuck out. Michael." I placed my hand on the door. Even with me adding just that small extra pressure, he wasn't strong enough to slam the door against my foot anymore. He struggled for a moment anyway and then stopped trying, which left us at an impasse. "Michael," I said, "it's okay." He looked at me, more obviously frightened now. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said. "I do. You don't know how fucking dangerous it is for you to be here." A surge of anger threatened to rise up inside me. I wasn't sure where it came from, just that it was suddenly there. The desire to shove a little harder, force the door off its hinges, send him sprawling backward, detached. I reminded myself. "Calm. Listen to me, Michael," I said quietly. "This is really important. I understand because I was there that day too, all those years ago at the rest area. You know what day I'm talking about, right? Because you wrote about it. You made a website about the Pied Piper." That made him hesitate. While the terror remained in his eyes, it was obvious that what I'd said had thrown him. "You were there too," he said. "Yes." He blinked rapidly. Then he made the connection in his head. "Daniel," he said. "You're Daniel Garvey. That's right. Sarah and I were both there that afternoon." He looked at Sarah for a second, then back to me. Then he shook his head. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Have you seen him too?" The question made a shiver run through me. Even without telling us anything else, I knew he'd just confirmed the worst of what I'd been imagining. "Seen him?" I said. "No, I don't think so, but I think I do know what you mean by that, and how awful it must have been if I'm right. And if so, I think we really, really need to talk." For a long moment, he didn't reply, and I began to wonder whether I'd said too little or too much. It had been enough to knock him off balance, but for those few seconds it wasn't clear in which direction he was going to fall. But then he looked away from me, down at the floor. "All right," he said. "All right," and he undid the chain. "Oceanoff PDF, com. 24. I don't know why, but it's the lights and the trees I remember most," Johnson said. "Maybe because everything else is too horrible, but it's also because they seemed so out of place, like a fairy tale, like I was being taken away into a wood by a monster." "There's no such thing as monsters," I said. "Fucking hell," he said. "Didn't you listen to a word I said?" The three of us sat in silence for a moment. His question was reasonable. The account he had just given us matched what had happened to Rose Saunders. He had been abducted last week, late one night after drinking in a pub, a quiet, out-of-the-way place because the ones nearby were always busy and threatening. He had left his drink at one point to go to the toilet. He remembered leaving the pub and that the cold air had made him feel woozy and sick, and then nothing until the forest and the fairy lights, until he had been forced to watch a man die. I looked around now. His living room was small and sparsely furnished. There was just a settee and chairs and a plywood table with a portable television. Johnson was sitting at the end of the settee, Sarah and I on a chair each. A window took up most of one wall, and we were high enough up that it had felt like being in the sky when we first walked in, bright and airy despite the claustrophobia of the room, but everything seemed darker now. I glanced over at Sarah. She was staring down at the floor. "And you're sure it was Darren Field?" I said. "I'm sure." He nodded miserably. "I knew Darren back then. We were the same age, so we hung about a bit. I hadn't seen him in a few years, but he hadn't changed that much. As soon as I set eyes on him, there was this jolt of recognition, and somehow I knew. Knew what? That it was about that day, that the man behind me was him. But the man never said anything, just what I told you already. What he said afterward, that if I went to the police, then I'd be next. But he didn't need to say anything for me to know who he was, because think about it, who else could it be? You saw the boy that day. Yeah, the same as you did. I thought he was just some little shit looking to shoplift. I didn't realize he needed help. Not the same as me, I thought. Johnson might have felt culpable for doing nothing that day, but he was only a bystander. I had known for certain the boy needed help, and I had been too scared to give it. "You told the police it was Robbie Garforth you saw," I said, "because they showed me a photograph. It looked like him, so I figured it had to be. And you know what? I think I even wanted it to be. That's a horrible thing to admit, but it's true. Why did you want it to be Robbie? Because that meant the man was the Pied Piper, that he'd been right there. I know that sounds sick, but I was obsessed with serial killers back then, and if it hadn't been Robbie I saw, then it wasn't such a big deal, was it? Not as much of a story to tell people." He shook his head. On the face of it, he seemed disgusted with himself for having thought that way, but I wondered if that was really true, or if he was attempting to put psychological distance between the past and the present. If he wasn't that person anymore, then it was unfair to be held responsible for his actions. I didn't do it, it wasn't me. But not only had he created the website, he had maintained it. If his obsession back then really was a source of shame to him, he had done little to hide it since. I leaned forward and spoke as gently as I could. Michael, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever you did back then, what is happening right now is not your fault. I'm not sure about that. You have experienced something terrible, I continued, as though I hadn't heard him. Something that is beyond most people's capacity to. Imagine, and I want you to understand that whatever you're feeling right now is a rational response to the trauma you've suffered. I haven't suffered. You have. Not like Darren suffered. You weren't there. You don't know what suffering is. That's true, I said. But I have counseled people who have undergone similar experiences, and I do know that kind of trauma is not something that easily leaves you. Perhaps you weren't hurt like Darren was, but you were hurt. You are a victim here too. That's the first thing I want you to accept. What's the second thing? I took a deep breath. That you need to talk to the police. No, Michael, no. He shook his head again, more firmly than before. For fuck's sake, did you really not listen to anything I told you? No, no. Michael, but he put his head down and cupped his hands over his ears and just kept shouting that word, no, over and over again. Sarah looked at me helplessly, shocked by the sudden change in his demeanor. Detached, I thought, calm. I know it won't be easy, I said. Johnson's voice grew louder. It seemed inevitable that someone in a neighboring flat would hear him. But I forced myself to continue speaking quietly and deliberately. If he saw my words as an attack, I knew that a part of him would be intently focused on them. It will be frightening, but it's the right thing to do. Other people who were there that day have been killed. This man has to be stopped. Johnson looked up at me. That's exactly what I'm doing. If I don't go to the police, he does stop. I mean, are you fucking stupid or something? Do you not understand? He gestured frantically around the room. This is how I stop him. This is how I save however many of us are left, by doing nothing. Someone pounded on the wall next door. Ignore it, I told myself. You can do this. We don't know that will make him stop, I said. I don't think we know enough about him yet to be sure why he's doing this or what he wants. He told me, if I talk to the police can keep you safe. Oh God, Johnson said. They aren't going to believe me, you're out of your fucking mind. More banging from next door. There's corroborating evidence, I said. I think that, no, I'm going to forget it ever happened, because I think that's what he wants. He wants to punish the people who were there. He wants someone to take on the suffering and live with it, because we could have helped him and we didn't, and now he wants at least one of us to wallow in the guilt from that. We need to talk to the police, I said. No, 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 no. Michael, the pounding on the wall intensified. I could hear shouting from behind the plaster and then felt Sarah put her hand on my arm. Dan, she said, stop. I looked down. Without realizing it, my fists were clenched. We should go, Sarah said. Johnson was incoherent now, his body racked by sobs. Despite myself, I wanted to grab hold of him, drag him out of here, force him to go to the police if that was what it took. Careful, my son. At the sound of my father's voice, the anger retreated a little. I took a deep breath and then relaxed my hands. Then I got a business card out of my wallet and put it down on the settee beside him. If you change your mind, I said, call me. It might help just to talk. Dan, Sarah said, I'm coming. But even out in the corridor, I felt the urge to turn back. I stood by the closed door for a moment, trying to think what I could say to convince. Johnson, there must have been words, surely. I should have been able to find them. I was supposed to be able to do that. Sarah was already heading away, back in the direction of the elevator. Finally, I started after her. It was clear that the encounter in the flat had scared her badly, and I imagined she was also worried that one of Johnson's neighbors was about to come out and confront us. She needn't have worried about that. As I followed her past the flat next door, I could hear that the banging sound had stopped now. Most likely, whoever lived there had just been angry at being disturbed. Nobody sees, I thought, and nobody cares. Oceanoff PDF, calm. 25 back in the car, we sat together in silence for a while. I drove slowly and carefully, and Sarah stared out of the passenger window. As we approached the motorway, I said, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that I was scared back there. Yes, I said, I know. The way Michael Johnson had broken down would have frightened anyone, not to mention what he'd told us. I remembered her face this morning. Do you want to go on an adventure? But at that point it had still been academic, whereas it was another thing entirely to hear the truth in person, and to witness the effect such an experience had on someone. To have it confirmed that something terrible really was happening and that you had found yourself caught up in it. Sarah looked at me. "Are you okay?" she said. "You seemed angry back there. I haven't seen you like that before." "I'm okay. Careful, my son." The emotion seemed to have caught me unawares in Johnson's flat, but I understood where it had come from now. What Johnson had told us confirmed what was happening here, that someone out there was targeting those of us who had been at the rest area that day, setting up a chain of victims and killing one after the other. But it also removed the possibility that I had allowed myself to consider, even though I'd known it was dangerous to do so. It was Johnson who had watched Darren Field die, Johnson who was the most recent victim in the killer's chain. So while my father technically remained missing for the moment, there was no reason to believe that he was the next link in the killer's plan. The most likely explanation for his disappearance remained true, but understanding my emotions didn't make them go away. I felt stupid for allowing myself to hope, and I was also still angry with myself for failing to convince Johnson to go to the police. There must have been something I could have said that would have made him change his mind. The fact that I hadn't been able to find the right words made me feel small and useless. We joined the motorway and I accelerated. Sarah sighed. "What are we going to do now?" "Go home," I said. "Back to the island, I mean, try to think." "We could still talk to the police." I shook my head quickly. "No, we can go to Liam, he'll listen to me. I really don't think bringing you into this will help on that score." She considered that. "Maybe not," she said, "but you have the photographs. You have the connection between all the people who were at the rest area that day, and you have the same account of what happened from different people." "I don't have that at all," I said. "I have what Brian Gill told us, and that's pretty much all I have." "But maybe Darren Field's story would have been the same, but it doesn't matter now because he's dead and gone and he can't tell it. And you and I just heard it from Michael Johnson too, but we can't report what he said to the police, not without his consent." "Is that some kind of medical privilege thing? I know you're a doctor, but you're not his doctor." "No," I said. "Think about the repercussions if we did." It was possible that my father's conversation with Darren Field had led to Field's death, that in the killer's mind it had counted as Field talking to the police. I could imagine the guilt that would have caused my father, but the fact was that he couldn't have known what the consequences might be when he went knocking on Field's door. I wouldn't have the same excuse if something happened to Johnson. "If I talk to the police," I said, "I'm making the decision for him, be the one putting him in danger, and that's not my choice to make. But it's like you said, the police can protect him." That's what I told Johnson, but honestly, I'm nowhere near as confident about that as I might have sounded. I don't know much about the man behind this, but I do know that he's smart, he's determined, he's patient, he's a planner, he isn't the type to act impulsively. This is someone who's more than happy to bide his time, and the police can't protect Johnson forever. Sarah thought about it. "Okay, so what if Johnson was right? If he keeps the story to himself, then the killer will stop. Does that make sense, though?" "Fucking hell, none of it does to me." She gave a half laugh. "This is supposed to be your area of expertise, Dan. Have you ever encountered anyone like this before?" "No." The truth was that I could attempt to categorize him as much as I wanted, but in my experience, killers rarely operated the way this one did. Serial murders were uncommon in this day and age anyway, because most offenders were caught before they could progress beyond one or two victims, but when they did occur, they rarely displayed this level of complexity and planning. They were simple and brutal, the ugly endpoint of a disturbed and fractured mind, not one that wanted to make a statement or play games. "Do you have any idea why he's doing what he's doing?" she said. "No." I remembered what I'd imagined the killer saying to me on the ferry. "The truth is you have no idea what I'm doing. You've spent your whole life avoiding thinking about me, pretending you could just leave what you did to me behind, protecting yourself." I looked ahead at the motorway and realized where we were. "No," I said again quietly, "not yet," and then without thinking about it, I signaled. Sarah looked to the side, confused. "Where are we going?" I didn't answer. But as I drove down the exit off the motorway, I saw her settle back nervously in her seat beside me, and I knew that she didn't need me to. "Have you been back here since?" Sarah said. There were so many parking spaces that it was difficult to be exact, but I tried to park in roughly the same spot my father had on that afternoon all those years ago. "No," I said. "You? Of course not, why would I? I can get an out-of-date cheese sandwich and a packet of crisps anywhere." She peered out through the window. "And this is just a place." "Maybe," I said. It was a place that hadn't changed much. The motel remained to one side, a different chain now, but no different apart from the signage on the front. The tiled slope ahead that led into the main building was exactly as I remembered it, just a place. That was true on one level. But looking around, I found it easy to picture a figure smoking against the wall of the motel, and a van selling flowers to one side of the entrance. For a brief moment I even sensed the shadow of a vehicle parked beside us, its dirty metal sides patterned with small handprints beneath a rusty grill over the window. "Why are we here, Dan?" Sarah said. "Because I need to talk to him, the man who's doing this." "What you think he's here, number I mean in my mind," she hesitated. "You know that sounds really weird, right?" "Probably," I said. "I've been trying to put myself in his head for a couple of days now, and it's not working, but maybe I spent so long not thinking about him that it's hard to do it properly now. Perhaps if I want to understand him, I need to start from first principles." I took a deep breath, "and that means being here." I opened the car door. I wasn't sure if Sarah was going to follow me, but after a moment she did. We walked across the car park together, and then inside. It had changed in here. The amusement arcade was gone now, replaced by a sprawl of beige tables and chairs. What had once been the burger counter was now a currency exchange window in the wall, and while the shop remained in the same place I remembered, the layout was entirely different. Everything seemed brighter and more open than I recalled it being. The toilets were still at the far end of the concourse. "I guess I'll wait here," Sarah said when we reached them. "That's probably for the best. Are you going to be okay?" I looked at her and did my best to smile. I really don't know, but there was no point in hesitating. I turned around and pushed open the door. The corridor had been renovated. The tiles on the floor and the walls were clean and new, and the air smelled of fresh lemon disinfectant. The lights above didn't flicker or hum. There was none of the sense of threat I remembered. No feeling that this was an adult space in which I didn't yet belong. The corridor ahead seemed much shorter than it had when I was a child. I walked down and turned the corner at the end. The layout was the same. The toilets were long and narrow, with the cubicles on the right-hand side and a urinal along the opposite wall. The sink and mirror were at the far end, just as they had been back then. My reflection stared back from the mirror. It seemed to approach me as I walked forward. I stopped halfway across the room and closed my eyes. "I'm here," I thought, then I waited. After a few seconds the temperature dropped, and I sensed the lights begin to dim and flicker. From somewhere in the back of my mind, the faint sound of whistling drifted free. A shiver ran down my spine at the noise. It was the same deliberate and careful melody I'd heard back then, somehow. Both familiar and impossible to place. My heart started beating faster. On a rational level, I knew that all of this was just my imagination, that I was alone in here, but it no longer felt like I was. "Okay then," I thought, "let's take a look at you." I opened my eyes. The little boy in front of me was exactly as I remembered him. Skinny frame all but lost in the baggy old clothes, a streak of dirt across his cheek, eyes wide and desperate. He did look a little like Robbie Garforth, but it was clear to me now that it was not him, and I wondered how I had ever allowed myself to be convinced otherwise. The whistling was coming from the closed cubicle beside him. The boy looked at it for a second, and that reminded me of the moment when I had ducked into a cubicle of my own to hide, but this time I remained where I was. As awful as it felt to be back here, I knew deep down that nothing was going to hurt me right now. A moment later, the boy's terrified gaze returned to my own. Help me, and I wanted to, so desperately. If I had been an adult back then, I would have walked across, picked him up in my arms, and carried him out of here to safety. But it was too late for that now. "I can't," I thought. "Please, I can't. That's not why I'm here. I hate you." His face contorted in rage. "I hate you all so much. I know." Then I glanced at the closed door to the cubicle. "Why didn't you run?" I thought, when he was locked away in there. "Because I could never be fast enough. Nobody could." I kept looking at the closed door. It occurred to me what arrogance the Pied Piper must have had to leave the boy out here like that. There had been moments when the boy had been wandering the rest area, all but unattended as well. It was hard to imagine possessing that degree of confidence and control. I had no idea what the boy had gone through before that afternoon, but it must have been terrible enough for him to see his captor as all-powerful. For it to be impossible for him to fight back by then. I looked at the boy. "What did he do to you?" "He broke me down. That's enough for you to know." "I'm sorry," I thought. "I'm so sorry. You will be. All of you will." But there was an itch in my subconscious, and I forced myself to run back through my thoughts, trying to work out what had caused it. The sense of control, that was it. The Pied Piper's behavior that day appeared arrogant and brazen, and there had been no obvious need for him to take the risks that he had. But nothing he did would have been unnecessary. In his own warped mind, there would have been a reason for everything. And that included the way he had put the boy on display. It had been done for a purpose. Nobody sees, I thought, and nobody cares. That's right, none of you saw me, none of you cared, and that's why I'm hurting you now, to punish you all. I stared back at the boy. His eyes were full of hatred, and I could feel that same emotion mirrored inside me, the guilt and self-disgust rising to the surface, threatening to overwhelm me. I did my best to fight it back down. Because however keenly I felt it, what the boy had said, "That's why I'm hurting you now," wasn't the whole story. No, I thought, that's not quite right, because all of us did the wrong thing that day, and I can understand you hating us for that. I hated myself for it, and I still do, but that's not why you're doing this, is it? The boy didn't reply. I looked at the closed cubicle door again, chasing the idea. You give the people you attack a choice, I thought slowly. They can do the right thing or the wrong thing. You reward them for doing the wrong thing. It's only if they do what's right that you punish them. And at that point you hurt them very badly, don't you? The violence is ferocious and out of all proportion. You are raging when you kill. I looked back at the boy. But it's not them you hate, I thought, it's you. The whistling stopped, and immediately the boy's demeanor shifted. All the fury seemed to leave him, and in my mind's eye he was just a child again, one who looked even smaller than before, emaciated, frightened, broken down. And then he began crying. Nobody sees me, he sobbed. Nobody cares about me, you in particular, yes. I didn't matter to anyone, nobody loved me enough to look for me, nobody missed me. I meant nothing to the world. He was teaching me that I was worthless, that I didn't deserve to be saved. And he was right, wasn't he? No, I thought he was. You were never worthless, I want to believe that. The boy wiped his nose with a trembling hand. I've tried so hard to. I've told myself that it was your fault, all of you, and I've done my best to hate you instead. But it's me that's disgusting, it's me. He began pounding his small fist against his chest. The hollow sound echoed around the toilet. It was sickening to hear, and even though I knew there was nothing really there in front of me, I still felt the urge again to walk across and comfort him. But it was too late for that. That's why you punish them if they do the right thing. Yes, if they do the wrong thing, that means they were bad people all along. They're the worthless ones, not me. They don't see or care about anyone. Every second they keep silent, I can pretend to myself that it wasn't about me. But if they see, I thought, if they care, then it means the man was right. The boy stopped hitting himself. And then suddenly he was directly in front of me, screaming into my face. And I can't bear THAT. Despite myself, I took a step back, bringing my hands up. The wave of white-hot rage burning in front of me offered a glimpse of what his victims must have faced in their final moments. The self-hatred simmering inside him bursting suddenly and horrifyingly into flame, and I heard the door to the corridor behind me opening. Immediately, the vision before me disappeared. The light was normal again. The boy was gone. I stepped quickly over to the sink, my heart pounding. "Help me," the boy whispered. I pressed down hard on the tap, once, twice, work. In the mirror I saw a father and son walking into the toilets behind me. The man was encouraging the child with a gentle hand on his back. "Just go in there, champ. I'll be out here the whole time, I promise." I looked back down again. The water was running now. I made a show of washing my hands, watching in the mirror as the little boy stepped nervously into one of the cubicles and closed the door. The lock clicked. His father folded his arms and waited. I moved over to the hand dryer. The roar of it filled the air. "Help me," the boy whispered again. "I can't," I thought. "It's too late." "So what are you going to do?" I tried to get myself under control. "What someone should have done all those years ago," I thought. "I'm going to find you." Oceanoff PDF, com. 26 John parks on the road by the cemetery. When he turns the car engine off, the world is silent apart from the gentle rush of the breeze outside the car. There is a grand arch of stone beside him, through which he can see leafy trees and neatly tended grass illuminated by the mid-morning sun. He has come to this place twice a year for the last 4 years, and every time has been struck by how tranquil it is here. Walking into the cemetery always feels like you're stepping out of the busy outside world and into a quieter, more restful one, the atmosphere settling on your skin like soft spring dew. He follows the wide path between the old and ornate headstones that are closest to the entrance. As the main path curls around, smaller ones begin to lead away to the sides. There's no apparent rhyme or reason to the design. The cemetery is its own little city. Over the years, he has come to think of the paths through it as streets and the plots where people are buried as homes. It's a comforting idea, he supposes. It suggests that your loved ones haven't left you entirely, just moved, and that there will always be an address you can find them at when you want to. But he is not visiting a loved one today. After about 5 minutes, he stops. This particular grave is tucked away down a small side road of the cemetery and has only a cheap, simple stone marking the plot. No flowers rest on this patch of grass. The ones he brought in July have been removed. He always brings a small bouquet, a meager offering he knows, but it feels like something. John puts his hands in his pockets and reads the inscription on the stone before him. Abigail Palmer. 6 March 1970, August 1998, the breeze sets the leaves rustling in the small grove of trees to his right. He glances over. The grove is empty for the moment, but while he doesn't believe in an afterlife, there have been times standing here in the past when he has imagined a presence there. Brief moments when he has pictured a woman watching him from the shadows between the trees. It's possible she resents him for keeping her story and James' to himself, but he's always hoped that Abigail Palmer, otherwise forgotten by the world, might appreciate that at least one person remembers them. As he looks at those trees now, though, he can feel a different presence building there. Given everything that has happened, everything he has done, and everything he has learned, a shiver runs through him at the thought of what other ghosts might appear there today, all the people he has failed, and he wonders what they might scream at him, one person a night. It was 14 years after he first began his search, 4 years ago now, when John finally found her. A storm was lashing the island that night. Rain was pelting the windows and wind was rattling in the eaves. And John was sitting in the darkness, dog-tired and thinking he should go to bed. One person a night, though. He opened the file and it was Abigail Palmer. He read the details cautiously. Abigail had been found dead in her flat on August 28, 1998, a few days after neighbors first reported a smell of decomposition gathering in the corridors of the tower block. When police broke down the door, they discovered the body of the young woman lying in bed, the air in the room thick with flies. The coroner's report concluded that Abigail had taken a deliberate overdose of pills and that she had been dead for over a week before she was found. Nobody had even realized she was missing. Abigail's family history was volatile, and she had long been estranged from her parents. Her life had been a difficult one. Periods of employment and stability were brief punctuation marks in much longer and darker passages. Mental illness, domestic violence, drug use, reading about. Abigail broke John's heart a little. The file gave the impression of a drowning woman who kept coming up for air and who might have been saved if someone had noticed her in time, but nobody had seen Abigail. At the time of her death, she was out of work. She had no friends to speak of. None of the other residents on her floor had even known her name. Only one person vaguely recalled that, when she had first moved into the tower block, there had been a little boy living with her. It was impossible to be sure of Abigail's motivation for taking her own life, but the coroner remarked upon the close relationship she had previously had with her son, James. By all accounts, she had loved the boy deeply, and he had always been her reason to drag herself back from the blacker places she was drawn to. James had been 11 years old. Like his mother, he was quiet and anonymous. Small for his age and frequently bullied because he insisted on carrying a stuffed toy lion with him to school. The two of them were each other's best friend, and then James had died in an accident earlier that year. To compound the loss, Abigail had blamed herself for his death. The two of them had been on holiday, staying out of season at a cheap campsite on the coast. There were few amenities, but the weather was half decent and they had the place to themselves. The small beach at the site was all shingle and stone, but they played frisbee there and skimmed stones, enjoying the quiet. Abigail warned James to keep away from the sea, because the currents were strong and he had never learned to swim. But at some point, lulled by the pills she had promised herself she would stop taking, she had fallen asleep on the beach. When Abigail woke up an hour later, the sun had gone in and the air was cold, and James was nowhere to be seen. Still groggy, she had stood up and called his name. Her feet had crunched in the shingle as she stumbled down toward the edge of the water, and from there along to the next little cove, where she found James's shorts folded up on the rocks by the water. There was only one phone at the campsite, 5 minutes back up a footpath. It was over half an hour before the police arrived, a little longer than that before the Coast Guards began their search. The next day, James's stuffed toy lion was discovered washed up a short distance along the shore. The coroner's report noted that it was the last evidence of James that was ever found, although that was not unusual for that particular stretch of coastline. In the meantime, police had looked at Abigail and seen what they wanted to see. A negligent mother, yes, but one who had also been frantically honest with them. Consumed by guilt, she had told them exactly what drugs they would find both in her system and in the car. At the time of her death, there were still a number of potential charges hanging over her. John read the report through several times. One line in particular resonated with him, although he wasn't quite sure why. Abigail Palmer, the coroner suggested, had been a woman who felt things very deeply. The file also included the single surviving photograph of James that anyone had been able to find. It had been taken years before his death when he was still in primary school, but the sight of it took John's breath away. When he compared it with the sketch that Daniel had contributed to, he might have been looking at the same person. The next weekend, he took the ferry and drove to the campsite where James was believed to have drowned. He walked down to that sad, stony little beach and stood there in the cold wind for a time, looking out over the sea. It was a desolate place, lonely, isolated. It felt right, and as he walked back, an old camper van drove in down the entrance trail and parked in a dusty bay by the side. John sat in his car, watching it, and eventually a young family got out. But the vehicle was the same make and model as the one he remembered from the rest area, and he couldn't help seeing its arrival right then as a sign. A small nod of acknowledgement from the universe that he was right, that this was the place. That James Palmer was the boy his son saw that day. That through sheer force of will, after a decade and a half of bloody-minded searching, John had done what nobody else could. The weeks afterward were ones of careful consideration. It felt like he should report what he had discovered, and yet for some reason he found himself hesitating. What would it achieve, he wondered? Justice. That was the obvious answer, except what did justice amount to in this case? The Pied Piper was long dead, and surely so was James Palmer. There were no grieving relatives or friends awaiting a resolution. The world had forgotten Abigail and James almost before they were gone. And knowing the boy's name would not bring the police any closer to identifying who the Pied Piper had been or where the bodies of his missing victims might be buried. Validation, then, for some people, that would have been reason enough to come forward. Assuming John was right, he knew that what he had found would make a mark on the world. He would become known as the police officer who had refused to give up, who had gone the extra mile, who had pulled off what others might have considered impossible. He would get the recognition that had eluded him all his life. The idea was appealing, but it also left him feeling strangely empty. If you took the bad on the chin without flinching, then the same should be true of the good. Whatever anyone else thinks of you, it should be enough for you to know that you're enough. The final reason, then, his son, and in the end, it was Daniel who made the decision for him. It was a few years ago, not long after John identified James Palmer, and Daniel had returned home for a visit. They were sharing a drink outside one evening, and John mentioned his hobby, the research he did into cold cases to keep him occupied, and Daniel asked what he thought he could contribute to the investigations. John had stared down the garden for a time. Brute force, he said. Daniel had made a joke about it. You just want to be like the characters in the books you read, and there had been a moment when John had felt an urge to shake his head and tell his son everything, to justify himself, to make Daniel proud of him. But he had begun his investigation in the hope of healing his boy and bringing the two of them closer together, and that all seemed so long ago now. They were closer. The boy his son had been back then was gone. Daniel was a grown man now, accomplished and impressive. What possible good could it do for him to learn that he had been right all those years ago? The ground had settled, and the idea of John turning that soil over now and unearthing the past seemed selfish and wrong. So he had forced himself to laugh gently. The conversation had moved on, and he had told nobody what he had found. There was just those twice-yearly visits since, once on Abigail's birthday in March, and once again on James's in July. The very first time he went, he had brought a book with him. His son's tattered old copy of The Man Made of Smoke, or his own now, he supposed, and he had left it on the grave with the flowers. Let that be the end of it, he thought. Because he had never believed that any of it could possibly matter. John stares at the cluster of trees now. There is nobody there, of course, but he can almost see Abigail Palmer's ghost standing among them. On past occasions, he has imagined James there too. Even if he doesn't believe in an afterlife, he has always liked to believe that, if the boy's ghost were capable of finding its way anywhere, it would have been back to his mother's side, because he assumed James was dead. He can't sense James there today, but it does feel like other ghosts have joined Abigail in the trees. Oliver Hunter and Graham Lloyd, Rose Saunders and Darren Field. He hasn't been able to track down Michael Johnson, but perhaps he is there too. Regardless, the mingled voices John hears in his head are loud enough already. We might be alive if it wasn't for you. You fucked up again, didn't you? You failed us just like you fail at everything. There's no answer to those accusations. John feels the truth of them in his bones. He'd imagined he could draw a line and move on, that it was all history and wasn't important, but all these people might still be alive if he'd reported what he'd found. He used to think that he and Daniel's encounter with the Pied Piper had poisoned everything, but the reality seems starker than that right now. It's not what happened at the rest area, it's John himself. That afternoon was just another moment in a life spent slipping, falling, and failing. I'm sorry, he thinks, but the voices are too angry. There is no possibility of forgiveness there, and how could there be when the voices are coming from inside him? As they grow in volume and fury, he turns and heads quickly back down the path, moving faster, until by the time he reaches the car, he is running, his heart pounding hard in his chest. And yet the voices behind him seem to have kept pace, even grown louder with every step. It's all your fault. John leans on the side of the vehicle, breathing slowly and steadily, trying to calm himself down. But just as his pulse begins to settle, he registers a buzzing at his hip, his mobile ringing. He leans away from the car and takes his phone out of his pocket. The screen shows an unknown number and he stares down at it for a few seconds before accepting the call and lifting the phone to his ear. "Hello," he says, no reply. John shifts his body slightly, looking around him. He has the sensation of being watched, even though the world is serene and silent and there is nobody in sight. He turns back, pressing the mobile more tightly against his face. "Hello," he says again, silence, and then the man speaks. "Oceanoff PDF, com. 27. It was mid-afternoon when Sarah and I arrived back at the island. We didn't talk much on the drive home. For most of the journey, I was trying to process the thoughts I'd had back at the rest area, and Sarah either sensed that I wanted some space to do so, or else just needed some of her own. On the ferry, I kept an eye on the other passengers. Were we being watched? If so, I couldn't tell. Nobody sees, I thought, and nobody cares. When the ferry reached the island, I drove us to her mother's home and parked. When she got out, I followed her up the path and waited as she unlocked the front door. Then I went into the front room and rattled the latch on the window. She looked at me. "What are you?" Making sure the house is secure. For a second, it seemed like she wanted to argue with me. But then she stared down the dimly lit corridor ahead of us and shrugged. "Maybe do the kitchen first," she said. "I need coffee." On it, the kitchen window was locked, the back door bolted. Sarah set the kettle boiling as I headed upstairs, and I heard it rumbling away below me as I did a tour of the other rooms in the house. Everything was locked and safe. The kettle clicked off as I walked back through into the kitchen. We sat down at the table. "So," she said, "what are you thinking?" I warmed my hands on the cup as I told her my theory, that I thought the killer might be driven by a deep sense of self-hatred, and that his crimes now were an attempt to deal with that. That in some ways he was performing an experiment. If the people who failed him as a child turned a blind eye again now, that meant they were bad people, and that allowed him to accept himself for a while. If they didn't, he exploded into violence. The coffee was hot enough that my fingers were burning by the time I finished, but I didn't move them. "Accept himself for what?" Sarah said. "I don't know exactly. Maybe for things he saw and was made to do. We don't know what his relationship with the Pied Piper was. If he was abducted, we don't even know when. It's possible he ended up playing a part in the murders. Jesus. The point is, I think he hates himself more than you or I could imagine," I said. "And what do we do when we're angry with ourselves? We lash out. Have you ever done something wrong, but you were so annoyed with yourself that you couldn't admit it? More often than I'd like to say. And maybe you took it out on someone else instead." No comment. "It's a defense mechanism," I said. "It's what the mind does when it feels under attack. Obviously, this is an extreme example of that, but ultimately it's the same thing. Underneath it all, it's a little boy protecting himself." She was silent for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "So does that mean Johnson was right? If he keeps quiet about what happened, that gives the killer what he wants. The end." I shook my head. "No, because it's never going to be a permanent solution for him. The source of the anger, the damage remains unresolved. It's all still there inside him, and I think there's a part of him that enjoys it too. Do you remember what you said yesterday? There's a pleasure in dwelling." "Yeah, but this is an extreme example," I said again, "but it's the same thing." "And Darren Field didn't go to the police, did he? That didn't make him safe. The killer basically sent my father to his front door because I think he wanted an excuse to do it, which means that he's escalating. It's a mistake to think of his rules as being absolute. He's not a robot following a program. He's a mess. His rules are there to serve a purpose, but he'll bend them if they don't suit him. And I think he's started to like the killing more than the peace he imagined it would give to him." She hesitated, and then sighed. "So what do we do now?" "I'm not sure. I know you're worried that talking to Liam might put Michael Johnson in danger," she said. "But from what you've just told me, he might be in danger whether you talk to the police or not. It's still not my decision to make." Okay, so leave him out of it for now. Leave me out of it. Just tell Liam everything else. She leaned forward and looked at me. You can make the police believe it. I know you can. Maybe. I wanted what she'd said to be true. I wanted to believe that the insight I'd gleaned at the rest area was useful, and that a concerted police investigation, along with the expertise I could bring to the table, would be able to find him. That I was good enough, but I wasn't sure that I did. I moved my fingers from the burning hot cup. Maybe, I repeated, finally sipping the coffee, but I need to think. Sarah had a shift at the bar in a couple of hours, and we agreed that I'd meet her there later. In the meantime, I drove back to my father's house. After parking, I stood by the side of the car and looked around. There was no sign of movement on the sun-dappled lane. Even so, I stood there for a few seconds, not just to make sure the street was clear, but if I was being watched right then, to send a signal to whoever was out there that I wasn't afraid. Then I unlocked the door. Just as I had done at Sarah's house, I did a thorough search of the property, checking every door and window. There were no signs of disturbance. The building was secure, whatever else the man might have been doing today. He hadn't attempted to force entry here. That was reassuring on one level, but it was unnerving not to know what he had been doing instead. I went upstairs to my father's room. His old leather boxing gloves were still on the floor by the punch bag. I picked them up and turned them over in my hands, looking down at the map of cracked texture that the endless blows had worn into the fabric. It was strange to remember how huge they had seemed to me when I was young. So large that it had been hard to believe my hands would ever be big enough to fill them. When I slipped them on now, they fit me perfectly. I turned to the bag, then started off with left jabs, slow and steady, thud, thud, thud. One of the first things I'd done when I left the island and arrived at university was join the boxing club there. I never told my father. To begin with, I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I kept remembering how he'd tried to encourage me, and how I'd pushed back against it because that was his way of handling life, not mine. It seemed stupid all these years later, but at the time it had felt important not to admit that he might have had anything to teach me at all. After I'd warmed up with the jabs, I moved on to combinations, gradually increasing the strength of the blows. Thud, thud, thud. Thud, 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 but I had soon found a different reason not to discuss training with my father. It had quickly become obvious that, despite him trying to teach me to box when I was younger, he had never had any real idea how. He hit the bag every day, but that was all he was doing. The bag was a stand-in for all the frustrations and disappointments of his life, and he spent his evenings pounding it as hard as he could, lashing out with brute force rather than skill or technique. My father knew how to punch but not how to box, and in a fight he would always be taking as many blows as he landed. When I had understood that, I had felt sorry for him. That was one of the first times that I saw him not simply as my father, but as a man in his own right, one who was struggling to deal with the challenges of life in his own complicated way. There were occasions when I returned to the island afterward that I considered slipping on the gloves and showing him what I could do, but I never did. I understood enough by then to know it would mean showing him yet another thing that he could not. Thud. Thud, 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 thud. As I worked the bag now, I found myself slipping into a kind of gentle trance. I was often at my most relaxed at times like this, with my body performing movements that ticked thoughtlessly, like clockwork, leaving my mind free to wander. There were things I thought I knew about the killer. He was organized and intelligent, and even if he was escalating and beginning to change the rules of the game he'd set up, deep down he would still be motivated by the same underlying mission, to ease the guilt and pain and self-disgust inside him. But that was all interior. How would he present to the world on the outside? The nature of the murders suggested that he was physically capable and socially adroit. He had the time to research and plan. He traveled freely, where and when he pleased, without attracting attention. Despite the deep-rooted psychological instability inside him, he had managed to integrate into the world and maintain a veneer of acceptability. How had the boy I had seen back then become this man now? There were obvious practicalities to consider. He had been roughly my age, perhaps a little older, when I met him at the rest area, and the Pied Piper had died only a couple of weeks later. At that point, he would effectively have been free, so why had he never come forward? He had been unable to run from the man when he had the opportunity, which suggested that he had been indoctrinated. As I'd said to Sarah, perhaps he had been involved in the man's murders, an apprentice. In which case, it was possible that he had even been upset when the Pied Piper died and made a conscious decision to stay wherever it was that he was being held, assuming that held was even the right word by then. I hit the bag harder. That idea suggested a degree of self-sufficiency. If the boy had made it to adulthood without being detected, there had clearly been little need for interaction with the outside world. He had been able to grow into the man he was now in private, presumably living most of his life off-grid, at least when he was younger, which also fit with the fact that nobody had ever identified the Pied Piper. I remembered the muddy boots and filthy van. A working farm of some kind, perhaps. I was well aware that I might be overreaching here and that it was dangerous to make assumptions without evidence, and yet the thoughts were beginning to come as fast as the punches. Thud, 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 thud. I held the bag for a second, catching my breath, then pushed it away and started again. Thud, thud, thud. Why hadn't he reconnected with his real family? Perhaps they were dead, or there was nobody he wanted to return to. It was possible that after everything he'd been through, he no longer felt any connection to the real world. After all, his photograph had been widely circulated, and nobody had come forward. No child matching his description had ever been reported missing. And if nobody had cared about him before he was taken, why would he have assumed anyone would do so afterward, especially if he had done something terrible? I stopped again. The bag creaked back and forth on its chain for a second before I stilled it. My arms were shaky, my breath coming hard and fast. I tried to conjure up a presence behind me. Who are you? I thought. No answer. Where are you? No answer. I pushed the bag away again. As I started hitting it now, the punches began to come quicker and harder. Thud, 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 thud. The zen-like state of a few minutes earlier had deserted me. My subconscious had gone silent, which meant that there must be some detail I wasn't seeing, and that angered me. All the other emotions that had been building up over the last few days were close to the surface too. I could feel them brimming over, and then I lost any sense of technique. I just gritted my teeth and punched the bag with all my force, the blows reverberating through my arms and shoulders. Harder and harder, thud, 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 until I couldn't hit the bag anymore. I rested my forearm against the leather, and then my head on my arm, my heart pounding and my whole body trembling. After taking a minute to get my breath back, I opened my eyes. It had been stupid to lose control like that, and I was lucky not to have hurt myself. I had not been detached, I had not been calm. Even so, I felt exhilarated. Feels good, doesn't it, my son? I held still for a moment, then I thought, yes. It does. You've got pretty good, my father said. Thank you. I wish you'd told me. I understand why you didn't, but honestly it would have been fine. We all have our own ways of coping with things, don't we? And if mine was brute force, then what the hell? It worked for me, there's no shame in that. No, I thought, there is. I undid the straps on the gloves with my teeth and then pulled them off one by one. My hands were still trembling a little, but I could see blood beneath the skin between my knuckles. It reminded me of the time when I came back at the end of my first year at university, the night when my father had collapsed and I'd had to help him into bed. That was the moment when I'd realized how much the encounter at the rest area had affected him. That what happened to us all there haunted him too. Robbie, was that you? I'd been staring over at his desk when he said that. The computer had been open on a website. I'd been distracted by the empty bottles beside it, and hadn't bothered to look more closely, but I remembered seeing a box file on the otherwise empty shelves above. Still holding the gloves, I turned around and looked at the desk. In the years since, my father had filled the shelves above with his out-of-hours research material. The unsolved murders and disappearances he'd become intrigued by, the cold cases that were far more exciting than the mundane crimes he dealt with every day. I'd diminished his hobby when he'd first mentioned it to me a few years ago, because what did he imagine he could bring to the table that all the more experienced investigators who had worked on them could not? Brute force. Most of the box files on the shelves were labeled. I even recognized some of the cases from my father's handwriting on the spines, but that oldest one was not, and there were another 7 old boxes next to it that had been left blank too. You know what? I imagine my father saying now, sometimes a bit of brute force is exactly what you need. I put the gloves down carefully and walked across the room. Oceanoff PDF, com. 2 hours later, I arrived at the police station. What I had found shouldn't have surprised me. For all his faults, my father had always been tenacious, a man who, once he started something, kept going, brute force. Having worked through his files, I knew that my father hadn't just gone one step further than everyone else involved in the Pied Piper investigation, he had walked a whole marathon more. Stubborn, persistent, refusing to stop. It was difficult for me to imagine what had compelled him to research the case the way that he had. He had always been so adamant that I forget about it. It had been his disapproval that had led me to accept it was Robbie Garforth I'd seen that day, or at least that was how it had seemed at the time. But whatever his motivation for pursuing it, his efforts had brought him a name and a face. The shock I'd felt when I'd seen the photograph of James Palmer remained with me now. The boy might have been a few years younger in the image than he'd been when I saw him in the rest area, but there was no doubt in my mind that it was him. He matched the sketch I'd contributed to almost perfectly. More importantly, he fit with my memory. As I'd stared at the photograph, I might as well have been looking back in time. Why didn't you tell everyone you defound him, Dad? I thought, maybe because I didn't need to. The voice my subconscious gave him now was stronger than before. What would it have achieved if I'd gone to the police? He asked me. I assumed James Palmer was dead, and there was no family left to care about him. I didn't think it would make any difference. People would have known how much work you put in, I thought, maybe so, but what would it have done to you, my son? I stared across the darkening street. That made sense, didn't it? How would I have reacted, having moved on from everything, to being told that I'd actually been right all those years ago, and that I'd let James Palmer down not once but twice? Perhaps I wanted to protect you, my father said. Perhaps that's all I ever really wanted. I crossed the road. Inside the police station, it was the same officer behind the desk as on my first visit. He had been polite enough that time, but his face fell when he looked up and saw me approaching him now. Dr. Garvey, he said slowly. What can I do for you? I was Fleming's favorite person on the island, and the officer had the air of a man who took his lead from people he considered more important than him. If something of the school bully remained in Fleming, then this man reminded me of the boys who had stood behind him back then laughing. I need to speak to Liam, I said. He bristled slightly. You mean Detective Fleming? Obviously that's who I mean. You don't have a bunch of other Liams hiding back there, do you? I need to speak to him. Detective Fleming is very busy. He's about to get a lot busier. The officer took a deep breath. Everybody is working very hard, Dr. Garvey. But there haven't been any developments in the search for your father, and you're wrong. I leaned down on the desk. There have also been developments about the body that was recovered from the rocks yesterday. You just don't know about them yet. Because none of you are as good police as my father was. I held up the sheaf of paperwork I'd brought with me. Trust me, I said. Liam really wants to see me right now. That was very far from true, of course. As I was shown into Fleming's office, it was immediately apparent that the only reasons he might want to see me were ones that neither of us was going to enjoy. After the door closed and it was just the two of us, he stood up and walked round from behind his desk, stopping a distance away from me that was clearly meant to be intimidating. You've got like a little boy who had a toy taken away, except that he was very much a grown man now. I was aware of both his physical presence and the fact that we were alone together in his office right now. You are detached, I told myself. You are calm. Sarah's my friend, I said. Like I told you the other night, there's nothing more to it than that. Like a little boy who'd had a toy taken away, except that he was very much a grown man now. I was aware of both his physical presence and the fact that we were alone together in his office right now. You are detached, I told myself. You are calm. Sarah's my friend, I said. Like I told you the other night, there's nothing more to it than that. And I'm supposed to believe you, Liam. I ought to beat the living shit out of you. And at that, he bunched his right hand into a fist down by his side, but if it was meant to scare me, it did the opposite. It was such a clumsy tell that I relaxed the moment I saw him doing it. He wasn't going to be able to put a hand on me. I imagined my father standing behind me, watching all this unfold. What would you do right now, Dad? I thought. Nothing too silly, my son. Just give a good account of yourself. We're not teenagers anymore, Liam, I said. Why don't you try? Fleming looked to one side and snorted quietly, and then, not even deigning to look back, he reached out to grab the front of my shirt. I stepped to the side, turning at the waist so that he grasped at air, and while he was off balance and still reaching, I tapped him with the knuckles of my free hand, once, twice, first in the solar plexus and then up on the chin. I pulled the shots but made sure there was enough speed and force there for him to understand that it had been my choice not to land them harder. Before he could react, I stepped past him and slapped the file of paperwork down loudly on the desk. He turned slightly, staring at me in shock. What the fuck, you just assaulted a— No, I said. I just defended myself very gently against an attempted assault, but I can imagine what you're thinking. Your word against mine, right? I gestured around the office. But the thing is, Liam, I look at my professional record, and then I look at yours, and I'm happy to take my chances. So if you want to try doing that again, then by all means go for it. But if I were you, I'd make a call to your guy out front first, because trust me, you're not going to manage it by yourself. Fleming rubbed his chin. I'd barely made contact, but the real damage had been done to his ego, and it was touch and go right now as to what he was going to do. I tapped the file on the desk to focus his attention. Or we could talk about this, I said. Which is much more important? He looked at the file, then back up at me. After a couple of seconds, his curiosity got the better of him. What's that? He said. Let's start with Darren Field. Who the fuck is Darren Field? I think he's the man you fished out of the sea yesterday, I said. He didn't drown, did he? He'd been badly hurt. He was murdered before his body was dumped in the water. How do you? I don't, I said. I don't know for sure, but here, look. I opened the file and picked out the top sheet, a photograph I'd printed from one of Field's social media accounts, and held it out to Fleming. You know I didn't see the body, I said, but I'm betting I'm right. Does this man look familiar to you? Fleming hesitated, still performing a few final mental calculations about what to do next, and whether that involved trying to hurt me. But he understood deep down that might not go well for him, and I thought I'd also done just about enough to pique his interest and offer him an exit ramp. He took the sheet of paper off me and looked down at it. I waited. Maybe, he said. But it was obvious he recognized the face on the printout. And yet there was no satisfaction in being right. Unless you counted our encounter at the rest area, I had never met Darren Field, but it was still upsetting to have it confirmed what had happened to him. I thought about his wife, how she clearly loved him, and was probably still waiting for him to come home even now, and the old guilt began to rise up, threatening to break the surface. There were so many chains of cause and effect at play here, but the truth was that if I had been better all those years ago, he would still be alive. All right, Fleming said. Who is this guy? I shook my head. That's going to take some explaining. So explain, I'm going to, but to do that I need to start at the beginning. I picked another sheet of paper from the file, and then I took a deep breath. I need to start with a boy named James Palmer, Oceanoff PDF, com. 29 hours passed. Whatever other qualities Fleming might have lacked as a man, he was predictably ambitious. I imagined he was as bored and frustrated with police work on the island as my father had been. Perhaps he liked to think of himself as a king here, but he must have known that his court was a small one. The case I laid carefully out for him was bigger than anything he'd ever encountered, big enough for him to make a name for himself. If I had arrived at the station without any evidence, then I had no doubt he'd have given me short shrift. Instead, I had provided him with a name for the body found yesterday, and as I walked him through the rest of the case, he became increasingly engaged. I could see it in his eyes. The potential glory of solving the investigation was enough for him to forget how much he hated me. I explained who James Palmer had been, showing him the photograph and the sketch. I showed him the picture that had been delivered to my father, and explained how it had led me first to Darren Field, and from there to Rose Saunders and the other victims, all the people who had failed to save James that day. I made sure to flatter him by allowing him to make a few of the connections himself rather than spelling them out, and at the same time, I didn't give him everything. He didn't need to know about Sarah's involvement for the moment or about our visit to Michael Johnson's flat today. The former would only inflame him. The latter still wasn't my decision to make. If the investigation led Fleming to discover either thing, then I would deal with it then. He worked at the computer the whole time, looking up details to corroborate what I was telling him, and even making a couple of calls to departments on the mainland. I waited patiently through those, attempting to glean information from the one side of the conversation I could hear. He wasn't being told anything that contradicted the theory I was presenting him with, and he was listening to at least a few details that confirmed it. Finally, I showed him the last item in the file. He looked at it and frowned. "What's this?" "It's a photograph," I said. "Of me. It was taken 3 days ago in my father's garden on the night I came back to the island. I had no idea anyone was there. Whoever took it delivered it to the house yesterday. They wanted me to find it." It surprised me how calm my voice sounded. The truth was that it took all my resolve to sit there across from Fleming as he stared down at a picture of me at my most exposed and vulnerable, my emotions on display. But it was necessary for him to see it, I thought, Not only was it part of the story, if I hadn't already convinced him then, I imagined being this open in front of him would help to clinch it. He studied the photo for a time, then leaned back. "So," he said, "what's your theory?" "My theory? Well, you're the serial killer expert." He gestured around the office as though it was a stage and he was giving me a rare chance to audition. "What do you imagine is going through this guy's head? What makes him tick?" Well, off the record, of course. Yes, I thought, of course. I had just delivered Fleming not only a solid lead on an existing serial killer, but the key that might unlock an older mystery too. He had nothing approximating a poker face, and I could see him doing the calculations in his head. Off the record, the avarice in his expression was barely hidden. He wouldn't want anyone else taking a cut of the credit. I imagined my father standing behind me. "Let him have his moment, my son," he said. "Just keep him on side for now. Play the long game." "I will," I thought, "but when this is over, you're going to get your due. I'm going to make sure that everyone knows it was you, Dad." "Off the record," I repeated carefully, "I've never encountered anyone like this. He's intelligent and organized, and I assume he functions well in society. He moves freely without attracting attention. On the surface, he probably appears relatively normal. But from the ferocity of the murders, there's clearly a deep well of rage and hate inside that's driving him. Makes sense, but I think it's more complicated than that. Really, go on." As best I could, I explained my theory, that the killings were a kind of test, an experiment designed to counter the worthlessness the killer felt. Fleming nodded as I was speaking, as though, again, it all made perfect sense, and I was sure I sounded confident and convincing. But even as I was speaking, there was still a wrinkle of doubt in the back of my mind. The picture I was painting was almost right, I thought, but it still felt like there was a piece I was missing that might change everything. What was I seeing? "But I don't know," I said finally, because it felt important to voice the doubt. "There's still a lot I don't understand. For one thing, I'm not sure how James Palmer could possibly have survived all these years without being discovered. My father must have assumed he was dead, and I would have done too, but there's also just something. Like what? I don't know." Fleming leaned back and folded his arms, waited. I did my best to ignore him. Instead, I thought back to my encounter with James Palmer in the rest area toilets, remembering the fear I'd seen on his face. Please help me. Hiding away in the cubicle was the first time I'd failed him. And it turned out that I had failed him for a second time, when I gave in and agreed with the police's conclusion that it had been Robbie Garforth. Was I in danger of doing the same thing again now? I looked down at the photograph of James Palmer I'd brought with me. What evidence did I really have that he was the individual responsible for these murders? From my father's files, I knew that James had been abducted before the first known victim of the Pied Piper, and had still been alive 3 years later, which meant I also knew that he had most likely suffered more trauma than I could possibly imagine. But I also knew that trauma wasn't enough to make someone a killer. Fleming lost patience with me. "What? I just keep thinking about how he looked that day," I said, terrified, desperate for help. He would have run away if he could have done, but he was too frightened. "The one thing he didn't look like was a killer." I shook my head. "He looked like a scared little boy." Oceanoff PDF, com. James, August 2001. James lies awake in the darkness. The room is pitch black, and yet the air seems to be throbbing in his eyes and ears. He's been lying here like this for what feels like hours, his nerves singing the whole time. What is he waiting for? He isn't sure. There's no way to tell what time it is. No way to know how many hours have passed since the man brought him up here earlier. It had been the same as every other night, except for one small difference. Whenever the man closed the door in the past, James has always heard the sound of the key turning in the lock. Click, but not tonight. He had lain there listening, waiting for it, but the sound never came. Tonight, the man has left the door to James's room unlocked. But then why wouldn't he? He knows that James has accepted the truth now. The world doesn't want him. It never had. Nobody has ever seen him. Nobody has ever cared. And at dawn, the two of them will take the final step together. There was no more need for the man to lock the bedroom door earlier than there had been for him to worry that James would run away from him at the rest area. Except that the man doesn't know that. He only thinks it. James listens carefully. The house has been silent for hours now, surely, and if he leaves it much longer, then it will be too late. So he slips out from beneath the thin cover and stands up, listens again, hears breathing. He feels a burst of panic, suddenly sure that the man has been standing here in the room the whole time, motionless and invisible in the blackness. But that can't be true. James remembers watching the door close. Later on, he saw the thin line of hallway light at the bottom go out. It's his own breathing he can hear. With his palms out in front of him, he walks blindly across the room in what he knows to be the direction of the door. The floorboards are rough against the soles of his bare feet. When he reaches the wall, he takes a step to one side, feeling for the handle, finding it, then he turns it very gently, a centimeter at a time. The door opens inward with the quietest of creaks. James listens again carefully. When he hears nothing, he dares to open the door a little wider, his hand trembling the whole time. Then he steps out into the corridor. It's dark, illuminated only by a wedge of moonlight from the window at the far end. That's where the stairs are. There are 3 doors in between. The nearest is the bathroom, but he doesn't know what's behind the other 2. He assumes one of them must be the man's bedroom, but he has no idea which one. They're all closed right now. James wishes that he had Barnaby here to protect him. But the man threw Barnaby into the sea on the day he abducted him, and so he'll have to find the courage inside himself instead. He starts to walk down the hallway, one small step at a time, imagining that his feet are barely touching the ground, that he's lighter than air, and it seems to work. He can feel the soft push of the carpet against his feet as he creeps along, but every footstep is as quiet as snowfall. He reaches the first door. If the man were to step suddenly out of nowhere, this is the final spot for him to claim he was just going to the toilet. The temptation to turn back is overwhelming, but he can't do that. He fixes his gaze on that window at the end of the corridor. At the moonlight, he can see through the dirty glass, at the outside world, the real world, and he keeps going, past the second door, the third. And then he is at the top of the stairs. He looks back down the hallway and all the doors there are still closed. There's no sense of movement, and everything is silent, aside from a faint rush of air he can hear from around the window nailed shut beside him. The stairs. He places his weight down gingerly, one step at a time, keeping a gentle grip on the banister for support. The living room below him is lost in darkness at first, but the shapes there begin to resolve the farther he descends. He begins to move a little more quickly, wanting to run, but forces himself to slow down. The danger might be above and behind him now, but he can still feel it, hovering like a knife that will drive itself between his shoulder blades if he makes the slightest mistake. He steps down into the living room, stands still, listens again carefully, and the house is no longer silent. It takes him a second to realize what he's hearing, and when he does, his skin goes cold. He turns his head very slowly. His gaze moves from the wall in front of him to the settee under the window at the far end of the living room, where the man is sitting. James holds his breath. As always, he can't see the man's face, but his gnarled hands are resting on his thighs, and an angle of moonlight lies over them like a sheet. They are entirely still. The soft sound of his snoring drifts over. James remains frozen in place, and the moment seems to go on forever. There's nowhere for him to hide. All the man has to do is shift slightly and open his eyes, and he'll see James standing there. And then he'll hurt him very badly before killing him for this betrayal. Once again, James feels the urge to go back. It wouldn't be impossible. He could creep up the stairs behind him, return to his room. The man would be none the wiser, and he would still be alive, but dawn is coming. If he takes part in the killing in the morning, then the last surviving fragment of him will be dead anyway. And once James realizes that, he feels a sense of resolve, that fluttering hope inside him replaced by a small core of steel. He breathes out quietly. Then he turns and moves into the kitchen. The man has left the door to the cellar unlocked too, and the hinges creak as James opens it. It's so dark that he can only see the very top step below him. Beyond that is just a black hole that seems to go down into the depths of the earth forever. He takes the first step, then the next, breathing in slowly as he goes, the air around him beginning to smell of freshly turned soil. Until he feels encased by the ground. This is what it must be like to be buried, he thinks, but he isn't buried, he isn't dead, he is alive. His foot touches the cellar floor. The darkness down here is absolute, and he doesn't dare pull the cord on the light in case the faint illumination somehow reaches the floor above. But he remembers the layout of the room from when he was down here earlier. He takes 4 steps forward, moving to the wall where the old filing cabinets are, then reaches out above them in the darkness and begins to feel his way along the row of keys hanging on the metal hooks there. They chitter gently as his hand moves over them. He finds the one the man used for the main gate when they left today. It's the only one he needs. That's what a part of him wants to insist, except that it's not good enough. So he keeps moving his hand to the left, searching for the other keys he saw earlier. He can't find them. Time stretches out, threatens to snap. Has the man moved them? The voice in his head telling him to run grows impatient and shrill. The silence is singing. But he ignores it all, focuses as best he can, and there they are. He stands there for a moment with the keys clenched tightly in his fist and his heart beating hard. God, can he really do this? He feels himself faltering. But then he becomes aware of all the invisible things in the room around him, all the souvenirs stored away in the bags and boxes that are lost in darkness against the walls to either side. This little room is a grave. There are ghosts here. And he can sense them in the air now. You are strong, they tell him. You are brave. You know what you have to do. Yes, he thinks. He knows exactly what he has to do. A few moments later, he turns and starts up the stairs. The doorway to the kitchen is a dark gray rectangle far above, and he keeps his attention focused on that as he climbs, expecting the man to step into view at any moment, but it remains empty. Back in the kitchen, he listens. Nothing. The house is entirely silent. And he's about to start moving when he realizes that's wrong, that it shouldn't be. He edges into the living room. The man remains on the settee under the window, the moonlight still draped over his hands, his face invisible. He doesn't appear to have moved at all. But the snoring has stopped, and yet there's no going back now, is there? Not after what he's just done downstairs. James imagines the man staring back at him from the black void where his face should be. How worthless you are. No, James thinks. No, I'm not. The man turns his head in the darkness, and then the snoring resumes. There's no reason to hesitate. James walks across the front room. He doesn't need to tell himself that he's lighter than air right now, because it feels like he really is. He walks past the man into the small porch at the front of the house, opens the door just enough to slip out through, and then, his heart giddy now, euphoria coursing through him, closes it quietly behind him. It's a cold night. The sky is clear and the moon is full, and the farm ahead of him seems so much brighter than the house behind. There's no need for him to be quiet anymore, not out here. He runs as fast as he can across the hard ground, heading all the way down to the wooden pen at the far end by the trees. James hasn't run this quickly in years, perhaps not ever, and he can't remember ever feeling so alive. The boy chained to the post is awake and alert. Perhaps he's too cold and miserable to sleep, but it feels like he was expecting him. As James skids to his knees in the dust, he can see the boy's bright eyes, and the terror there just makes the resolve in him fold over upon itself, becoming sharper and more defined, like the edge of a blade. "What are you doing?" the boy whispers. James takes hold of the padlock on the chain. "It's time to leave," he says. He works the first key on the ring into place. It doesn't turn, so he tries the second. He feels untethered from the world now, triumphant. "Where are we going?" the boy asks him. "We're going home," James says. The second key doesn't turn, so he moves on to the next. 3 more to go. Glancing up from the lock, he sees the hope in the boy's eyes now. "Do you promise?" "Yes," James says. "I promise." The boy smiles at him. And then everything is suddenly brilliantly lit, as though a camera flash has gone off, and the image of the boy's face is burned into James's mind as he winces and closes his eyes. When he opens them a moment later, the brightness remains. The whole compound is flooded with light. "Oh God," the boy whispers. Still kneeling in the dirt, James turns his head. The man is standing on the decking at the front of the house. The two of them stare at each other for what feels like an age, and then the man shakes his head and taps down the steps. James feels the hope die inside him. It was a trap, he realizes. All along, the man was setting him one final test. Just to be certain he had him, just to be sure he had broken him, and now there's nowhere to run. The man walks slowly across the compound toward him, turning the knife in his hand around, and as he gets closer, he begins to whistle his tune. Oceanoff PDF, com. 30 Fleming walked me back to reception. "You nervous about this fucker?" he said. "No, because I'm short-staffed, but I can probably have someone stop by and keep an eye on the house." I resisted the urge to point out that he'd been doing a good enough job of keeping an eye on the house already. I also didn't like the idea of one of his officers making an unplanned appearance. If I heard a noise in the middle of the night, then I wanted to be alert and on point, not wondering if it might be Fleming or one of his men stumbling around in my father's garden. "I'll be fine," I said. "Just catch him. We will." I walked down through the streets to the promenade. By now, the moon was low and bright in the night sky. I stood with my back to the sea for a while, shivering a little, the water lapping gently against the stone behind me. I watched the people walking past. Nobody was paying me any attention, but the doubt I'd felt back in the police station wouldn't go away. I tried to tell myself that talking to Fleming had been the right thing to do, but I also couldn't shake the idea that, without realizing it, I had made a mistake. Did I do the right thing, Dad? I imagined my father leaning against the railing beside me. Arms folded, one foot crossed in front of the other, head down and deep in thought. I don't know, my son, what do you think? That I haven't thought things through carefully enough, that there's something I'm missing. My father didn't reply. I shifted my weight a little. What if we're wrong? I asked him. About what? About it being James Palmer who's behind this. I imagined him coughing gently. I just want to be clear that I never suggested that myself. Fine, I thought, but it has to be someone connected to that case, doesn't it? So it was natural enough to make that assumption, and James was the obvious suspect. Yes, I thought, but now I wonder if I was jumping to the wrong conclusion, if I wasn't thinking carefully enough. James would have had so many of the markers I expect to find in my patients, but that's not enough to turn someone into a killer. He was just a little boy. When I saw him, it was almost like looking into a mirror. He was desperate for help. He wanted to be saved. The most likely explanation is the same as it was all along, that he ended up being another of the Pied Piper's victims. My father nodded. That's true, he said. But you're also right that whoever's doing this has to be someone with a connection to the case. Someone who cares deeply enough about what happened to James for them to take their self-hatred out on the people who were there that day. Yes, I thought. But who could that be? Someone else who feels guilty, my father said. I glanced to my right. There was nobody there, of course, but for a moment I could almost see my father, and his words echoed in my mind for a second. The doubt I was feeling had become a coil of dread. I had missed something, I was sure of it. I had made a mistake, and as I leaned away from the railing, I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone was ringing. I took it out. The number on the screen showed up as unidentified, and that coil of dread inside me grew tighter. I accepted the call and held the phone to my ear. Hello. For a moment there was no reply, just static on the line. And then a man's voice. Hello, Daniel. You've been looking for me. Who is this? I said. There's someone here who wants to talk to you. I waited. A few seconds later, a different voice came on the line. Dan, Sarah was crying. Please help me. Oceanoff PDF, com. 31 The Reach, early evening. The sun has been beating down hard on the island all day, but it's cold here. It always is. It's high up and exposed to the elements, but John thinks there's more to it than that. It's the extremity of the place. You're far away from the heart of the island, and whatever warmth circulates back there has faded by the time it gets here. It's a place of last resort. As far as you can go before there's nowhere left to go at all. He stands a distance back from the edge. For as long as he can remember, it's been a tradition for kids to approach that and get as close as they dare, egging each other on, not wanting to let themselves down and be laughed at. So many rites of passage seem to involve staring death in the face. And maybe that's not so strange, but it also strikes him as a shame that it's what the world expects of children. It makes him think of James Palmer, bullied for carrying his toy lion to school, and how the world might be a better place if people judged a little less and understood and cared a little more. The wind whips around him. Despite the temperature, the sight before him is beautiful. The setting sun is burning the edges of the clouds and bruising the sky behind them. Countless fiery flickers of light are appearing and vanishing on the water, scattered in tiny lines all the way to the horizon. If this ends up being the last thing he ever sees, it isn't so bad, because it isn't just the temperature that's making him shiver. He thinks about the phone call he received at the cemetery. The man told John that his name was Michael Johnson and that he needed help. John recognized the name. Michael Johnson was the teenager who had been working in the shop at the rest area that day. Johnson couldn't talk about what had happened. Over the phone, he claimed it was too much of a risk. Even seeing each other in person might be dangerous. Throughout the call, he had sounded panicked and frightened, and John hadn't needed him to explain why. He had simply suggested the most isolated spot he could think of for the two of them to meet. Perhaps John really is about to meet Michael Johnson here, but it seems equally possible that it's someone else who is coming for him now. A man who has been manipulating him this whole time. A man made of smoke, because however convincing he might have sounded on the phone, John isn't sure he believed a word of it, but it's his responsibility to deal with, and if he can't. The suicide note he wrote is still there in the glove compartment of his car. Notify my son. Before leaving the house to come here, he sat down at the computer, erased almost all of his browsing history, and changed the password. If something happens to him today, there will be just enough information for Daniel to pick up the trail and follow it, but only if he wants to. The trail is oblique enough for Daniel to miss the meaning if he isn't paying attention, or to ignore it if he wants. He can stay out of this, he can remain safe. To John, that feels like the way things have to be, but it won't come to that. He's going to deal with it himself. He stands for a while entranced by the view, and then, John, he turns around. Craig Aspinall is walking up the footpath from the car park, and the sight of the man gives John's heart a small jolt. Fuck, there's nothing strange about Craig being here, of course. He roams around the island every day, acting as an unofficial caretaker of its beauty spots. But this is the worst possible time for him to show up. John has to get rid of him as quickly as he can without making him suspicious. Craig, he calls. Aspinall throws a salute. Hey there, you okay? I'm good. John turns and nods at the sea. Just out here admiring the view. Craig stops beside him and stares out. Ah yeah, he says. It's always so pretty at this time of the day. Isn't it just, John says. It's already obvious from Craig's body language that he isn't intending to head off straight away, and John feels a prickle of sweat on his back. He needs the man to leave, but he can't afford to give the impression that anything is wrong. He has to go through the motions as best he can, act as though this is just another day. He's just out here enjoying nature. There isn't a monster somewhere out there in the trees, watching them both right now. As always, Craig offers him a cup of coffee from his thermos. John sips from it and does his best to engage in the requisite small talk. How are they doing? They're both doing well, or at least, as they ruefully acknowledge to each other, as well as you can be doing when you get to their ages. What have they both been up to? Not much. Craig talks about the daily tour he makes, checking on the land, repairing signs and fences, picking up litter. People right, he says, and John nods, people indeed. Craig asks how retirement is treating him, and John tells him that it's better than he expected, that he enjoys a quiet life with a slower pace. And as he says it, it surprises him to realize that it's true, or that it was before now, a moment of silence. And how's your boy? Craig says, not a boy anymore. Ha, I guess not. Time, right, it gets away from you. John thinks about the last time he spoke to Daniel when he was driving to Darrenfield's house. It seems like a lifetime ago. But even then, it had been weeks since their previous conversation. How is Daniel? It's not a question he can answer, and that causes a flower of sadness to bloom in his heart. He knows very little about his son's life, but he does know one thing at least. I'm proud of him, though, he says. Really? Yeah. John takes another sip of coffee. He's doing great, despite himself. He glances back at the trail that leads up to here from the car park. There's nobody there. But something strange happens while he's looking. After his head stops moving, the landscape doesn't. The wall of trees behind him continues to rotate for a second, and when he turns back, the same thing happens again. He tries to focus on Craig, but the man keeps being farther to the side than he should be, and his face has too many eyes now. I'm sure he'll be glad to hear that, Craig says quietly. John looks down at the thermos cup he's holding. He thinks about all the times out here on the trails that he's taken a coffee from Craig, just two old men sharing a drink, shooting the breeze, and putting the world to rights. But he notices that, even though Craig has as many hands right now as he does eyes, all of them are empty. He's not drinking today. Damn, John thinks, it's all that we want, isn't it? Craig says, our kids to be okay. John stumbles a little, drops the cup. You have kids, Craig. I did once. I didn't. Something pounds against John's right arm with such force that it knocks the breath out of him and bruises his lungs. There's a moment of disorientation, and then he registers that it was the ground that just hit him, or vice versa, and that the edge of the reach ahead has flipped upward into a ragged vertical scar. A second later, the world begins to spin sickeningly. Craig's muddy boots appear in front of him, but the sight of them is already lost in the whirling circle that life is becoming. Damn, John thinks again. Craig's voice drifts in from a different place. I did once, he says again, but not anymore. Oceanoff PDF, com. Part 5 Acceptance Oceanoff PDF, com. 32 I drove at a deliberate and steady pace, keeping the speed just a flicker under the limit. The white lights that arced over the motorway swept the inside of the car at regular intervals. You are detached, I told myself. You are calm. That mantra had been with me my entire adult life, ever since I first headed off to university. Being detached and calm had allowed me to put the trauma away and protect me from emotions that had threatened to drown me back then. It had also been a guide for my professional life. When things went wrong in a secure psychiatric facility, you needed to keep yourself under control, and the more dangerous the situation, the calmer you had to be. But I wasn't calm, I wasn't detached. And while I kept a careful grip on the steering wheel, it was all I could do not to put my foot to the floor and begin to swerve between the other vehicles on the motorway. You've got half an hour until the last ferry to the mainland. So you'll need to run, but you're good at running, aren't you? The man had done his best to sound impassive on the phone, his voice even detached and calm in its own way. But the anger just below the surface had been obvious. He was barely able to contain the hatred he felt or control the violence that wanted to erupt out of him. And yet the instructions he gave me had clearly been thought through carefully. Half an hour until the last ferry off the island, and I needed my father's car first. The man had left me with no time to think. But the calculation was a simple one. There was somewhere I needed to get to, because if I didn't, then Sarah was going to die, even as the man hung up. I was already sprinting up the hill that led toward my father's house. I attempted to call Sarah as I ran, hoping against hope that I had somehow mistaken her voice on the phone, but her mobile was turned off, and of course it was. Whoever the man was, he was organized and efficient. He had taken her. And if I didn't get to where he had told me in time, then all that violence inside him would be directed at her. Despite myself, I accelerated a little. "You're good at running, aren't you?" I conjured up a figure in the seat behind me. And even though it would do nothing to change the actions of the man in the real world, I allowed my subconscious to give that figure a voice, to let all the guilt and self-hatred that I'd hidden away for so long spill out into the car now. "It's what you did that day, isn't it? Ran away and hid like the worthless coward you are. You could have saved him, but you were too weak, too scared." I concentrated on the road. "What was it you said about me when you were still so sure that I was James Palmer? Underneath my behavior, I was just a little boy protecting himself. Maybe you should analyze yourself, doctor, because that's all you've ever been. Detached and calm. What a fucking joke you are." "Yes, I thought, you're right, all to hide the fact that he's dead because of you, because of all of you. Yes, I thought again, but because of you too." The figure fell silent at that. I could feel the rage beating off it, hot and feverish. "That's true, isn't it?" I thought. "You might not be James Palmer, but you're someone who cares that he's dead. And I think I was almost right before, was I? Whoever you are, you failed James too. And because you can't bear to face up to that, you take your self-hatred out on other people instead. All the people who might also have saved him and didn't. They're just stand-ins for how much you despise yourself. You're so fucking clever, aren't you?" I shook my head. "No, I thought, I'm not, because like I said, you're right. I have been running. I've closed myself off from so many things. If I really was clever, I'd have dealt with it all a long time ago. The truck in front was going too slow, so I indicated and pulled out to overtake. After I'd passed it, I pulled back in and forced myself to slow down to something approaching the speed limit. If I got pulled over, then I wouldn't get where I needed to be. I wouldn't be able to save Sarah, assuming I still could. As the lights washed over me, I registered a noise in the car and glanced down to my side. My mobile phone was on the passenger seat, buzzing softly, the screen illuminated. From the corner of my eye, I registered the incoming details. "Island Police." I reached down and accepted the call. "Dan," Fleming's voice. "Yes," I said. "Where are you, Dan?" I looked around, trying to keep my hands steady on the wheel. The motorway was disorientating at night. The pulses of light and stretches of darkness had a hypnotic effect, and the empty blackness of the surrounding countryside made the outside world anonymous and indistinguishable. "I might have been anywhere right now, or nowhere. I honestly don't know," I said. He hesitated. "I've just checked in with the police at Rampton," he said. "They had a call out to a flat there early this afternoon. Resident was a guy named Michael Johnson." "That's another one of the people who were at the rest area that day, right?" "Yes," I said. "He's dead." I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them again, the stretch of motorway and cars around me seemed entirely different. "How?" I said. "I don't know yet. It's developing. From what I can gather, they thought it might be a break-in gone wrong at first, but I get the impression that the scene is different. Different. Bad." I tuned Fleming out, trying to think it through. Michael Johnson was the most recent victim in the chain, and he believed that if he didn't report what happened to the police, then he would be safe. And yet the man had killed him anyway. And from what Fleming had just told me, Johnson hadn't been taken away for a second time like the other victims, with someone else forced to watch him die. He'd just been butchered in his flat. I could still sense the figure in the back of the car. "The hate there, the rage, what are you doing?" I asked it. "Sorry," Fleming said. "What was that?" "Nothing, I have to go, Liam." I hung up and tossed the mobile phone back down on the passenger seat. I needed to concentrate. I had instructions to follow. If I deviated from them and the man killed Sarah, then that would be my fault. And whatever I had done as a child, I would never forgive myself if I failed Sarah now. Another wave of light passed through the car. I could still sense the figure in the seat behind me. "Why did you kill Michael Johnson?" I thought. "What are you doing?" When the figure answered, it took me a moment to realize it was repeating my own words back to me. "I'm escalating," it said blankly. "It's a mistake to think of my rules as being absolute. All they do is serve a purpose, and I'll bend them if they don't suit me. "And what suits you now?" The figure didn't reply. I looked up and recognized the overhead sign lit up against the night sky ahead. The slip road was coming up. "What suits you now?" I asked again. I realized that it's the killing that brings me peace now. I signaled and took the turning for the rest area. A part of me expected the place to be as dark and dead as the fields around the motorway behind me, but of course it was. The hotel to one side and the building ahead were both brightly illuminated, and the car park was swathed in an artificial light that washed the other vehicles of color and painted them all sickly shades of amber. I drove in slowly, remembering what the man had told me. "You'll know what to do when you get there." A moment later, I spotted the old camper van. It was parked on its own, far off to one side, in one of the few small pools of darkness the car park offered. A shiver of recognition ran through me as I approached it and then pulled in beside. It was impossible for it to be the same vehicle I had seen here as a child. The Pied Piper's van had been found in a country lane 2 decades ago, the man dead behind the wheel. When the investigation had run its course, it would have been either locked away or destroyed. It would certainly never have seen a road again, but the similarities were uncanny. Streaks of mud obscured the license plate. There was the same black window in its side, the same dirt coating the metal. I couldn't see if there were little handprints pressed into the muck below, but I could picture them there. As I drew level with the cab, I had the sensation that the vehicle beside me had passed through time somehow, that it had winked out of a moment in the past and then arrived, intact and unchanged, in this one, here in the present. I could hear the sound of its engine rumbling softly. The driver's window was dark, the cab full of shadow. I could just about make out the vague impression of a figure seated motionless behind the wheel. Thump, a bright white face appeared suddenly against the glass, and I flinched. The cheeks and forehead were smooth and unlined, a thin line for a mouth, black hollows where the eyes should have been. It took me a second to realize that I was looking at a mask that the man in the cab was holding up against the window. He tilted it to one side as though it was turning its head to peer out at me. I could see the tip of his finger in the center of one black eye socket, like the pale smudge of a retina. I waited, my heart beating hard. And then my mobile buzzed beside me on the passenger seat. I read the message he had sent me. "Turn off your phone, throw it out of the window, make sure I see." I hesitated, unsure what to do. On the one hand, he was right there. But the van's engine was running, and I was sure the doors were locked, so there was no guarantee that I'd be able to get to him before he managed to drive away. Even if I did, I couldn't be sure that Sarah was even inside. He could have left her somewhere else, somewhere that she'd never be found. I looked up from my phone. The mask, still tilted, stared implacably at me, waiting for my decision. I switched the phone off. Then I put the window down and threw it out, listening to it clatter away across the tarmac. Perhaps Fleming or Rampton police would trace it eventually. If so, if it came to that, then it seemed right that this would be the last place they could track it to. If I was going to disappear, it was appropriate for it to be from here. The mask continued to stare blankly at me for what felt like an age. Then it ducked away out of sight. The camper van began moving forward. Not racing away, just crawling steadily out of the parking space beside me. The implication was clear enough. I released the handbrake and headed after it, keeping a little distance, following it around the perimeter of the car park toward the exit back onto the motorway. The van accelerated up the exit that led out of the rest area, and I matched its pace. And then, a minute later, we were both part of the traffic there, the tail lights ahead of me like a pair of red eyes staring unblinkingly back from the night. I had no idea where we were going, and no idea of what was going to happen when we got there. But as the overhead lights began to wash over and through the car again, I had a sensation that reminded me of what happened all those years ago. The feeling that I was leaving the real world behind and heading toward an entirely different one, somewhere out of time where anything might happen, a place where there would be monsters. Oceanoff PDF, com. 33. Come on, old man, John tells himself. Keep going. He rests his shoulder against the wooden post, then drives down with his feet, grits his teeth, and pushes as hard as he can. His shoes skitter in the dust a little, threatening to slip and only just holding. Is the post shifting a little? It's hard to tell. He keeps pushing, staring blankly down at his hands, shackled together at the wrist and ignoring the pain coursing through his body, and he counts silently to 5 before finally allowing himself to step back and rest. Deep breaths. Shivering in the cold night air, the wooden pen around him is small and square, 3 meters to a side by his estimate. The post stands in the very center. A metal plate has been screwed tightly into the side of it, and a short chain connects that to the shackles that bind his hands. Come on, he tells himself. He remembers little of the hours after being drugged at the reach. There's the sensation of having been in an enclosed space, perhaps in the boot of a car, and a dim memory of hearing the horns at the ferry terminal. But the first moment he recalls with any clarity is when he woke up here, however many days ago that was now. He was alone. There was no sign of Aspinall, and when John shouted out the man's name, his calls had gone unanswered, disappearing into the trees. Something about the quality of the silence told him that he was in the middle of nowhere. Nobody was coming to help him. The next thing he did was test the limits of his prison. If he could reach the fence, he reasoned, perhaps he could break off a switch of wood to use as a tool or a weapon. But the chain was too short. One by one, he attempted to pry apart the links, but that was no use either. They were much stronger than he was. Brute force was not going to help him here. He had then tried to use the little hand movement available to him to pull the post out of the ground. But once again, he had realized very quickly that wouldn't work. The post had been driven in too deep, because Aspinall was good at building and fixing things, wasn't he? The man had spent years now traversing the island, carrying out repairs on the trails and at the beauty spots. The whole time, John had thought of him as being almost part of the landscape, just a man you saw without seeing, talked to without really listening to. Aspinall was such a reliable part of ordinary, everyday life that it had never occurred to John to imagine he might be building something in a different place, intent on fixing something inside him instead. For a time, he had succumbed to despair, but also, shameful to admit, to fear. He was trapped and helpless, subject to whatever Aspinall's whims might be when the man eventually returned. John had remembered the story Darren Field had told him. He was so angry, he reds and blacks, he fucking screaming. And while he found it hard to square that with the picture he had of Craig Aspinall in his head, he knew now that image had always been wrong. Whatever else Aspinall pretended to be, in his own mind he was James Palmer's father. He hated himself. And he hated the people who had failed to save his boy that day. "You're going to die here," John had told himself, but then another idea had occurred to him. Perhaps brute force was not out of the question after all. Come on, he tells himself again now. And then he edges monotonously around to the opposite side of the post. He gathers his strength and leans into it from the opposite direction, pushing as hard as he can. A minute ago, he wasn't sure, but this time he's certain he feels it. The post moved. It's tiny, imperceptible, barely there, but it is there. He has to believe that. The post just moved back to correct the minuscule effect he had by pushing from the other side. He grits his teeth, determined to push the post ever so slightly past the point it was at before. Then he'll gather his strength, trudge back around, and repeat the process, over and over again, because that is what you do. You keep going. He stumbles as he circles back around the post. There's a jolt, confusing him. It takes a second to realize that he's carried on the wrong way this time and taken the chain to its limit. Stupid, worthless, old man, but that won't do any good. Deep breaths. He turns and reverses his course. It's just so hard now, though. He keeps trying to gather his strength, but there's so little of it left. For however long now, he has been chained up here, exposed to the elements, without food of any kind. Aspinall left him water at least, but in a metal dog bowl on the ground, and for the first couple of days John was damned if he was going to lower himself to drinking from that. But eventually the thirst had become too painful, the weakness in his body too profound, and so finally he had succumbed. As he had knelt there in the dust, lapping from the bowl like an animal, he had imagined Aspinall watching from somewhere in the tree line. Laughing at his humiliation, perhaps even taking a photograph, but if so, he hadn't made himself known. Until tonight, in fact, John has been alone. Time has begun to lose meaning. During the hottest parts of the days, he has maneuvered around the post like the minute hand of a clock, trying to catch the thin sliver of shadow it offered. At night, he has lain shivering in the cold, feeling his sunburned skin shining in the dark. And the rest of the time he has pushed the post, back and forth, over and over. There was a period of time, yesterday, when he had given up. He had put his efforts on hold in the midday sun and then simply not started again when it cooled. It had felt so easy just to sit there instead, to stop, because the post was implacable. You did your best, he had reasoned, but there came a point when the blows were too hard to pick yourself up from. A moment when you had to accept that you were beaten and there was no use going on. He had closed his eyes. No, a voice told him, keep going, give a good account of yourself, and he had opened his eyes again. It was strange because the voice hadn't sounded like the more familiar one he talked to himself with. It had seemed to come from somewhere away to one side, and it had been so clear that it was almost a surprise to see that he was still alone. But he had picked himself up again, and he had keep going. He leans back into the post now, pushing as hard as he can, putting as much of the little strength that remains of his frail body into it. He senses movement again, a little more than last time. He crouches down, resting for a few seconds, then stands up and heads dutifully, robotically back around the post, leans into it and pushes, because there's no time for him to rest now. Aspinall returned a couple of hours earlier, and he was not alone when he did. John watched, his mind repeating no, 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 as Aspinall dragged Sarah across the clearing toward one of the pens. He pulled desperately against the chain again and attempted to shout her name, but his throat was too dry and he couldn't make a sound. A short while later, the silence in the clearing had been interrupted by a sudden humming noise, and then the darkness broken by a series of bright lights blooming into life across the compound. The rows of pens had been transformed into a cat's cradle of wood and dirt and shadow, and then Aspinall had left, but he'll be back soon. John is sure of that. He tries to call out again now. "Sarah, can you hear me?" His voice is raspy barely. But it must carry a little, because a few seconds later he hears a muffled cry in response. She is alive, at least. It's going to be okay, he tries his best to say. I promise. Then he moves around to the other side of the post. He's so weak now, though, and angry with himself too. What he wouldn't give to have that handful of lost hours from yesterday back now. They might turn out to have made all the difference, and that's a horrible thought. That after being a failure all his life, he has carried on being one to the very end. It's another spur. He leans into the post, plants his feet against the ground, pushes as hard as he can. Come on, old man, he tells himself. Keep going. Oceanoff PDF, com. 34. The longer I followed the camper van along the motorway, the more the real world seemed to be falling away around me. The darkness of the countryside and rhythmic sweep of the overhead lights had the effect of a slowly swinging pendulum. The intermittent signage above began to lose coherence. The place names listed there meant nothing to me, the words appearing to be written in an alien language. While I should have been able to keep at least a vague grip on where we were, I was disorientated and lost, divorced from geography and adrift in time. All the while, the red lights ahead stared back at me. I kept a steady distance. After however many miles, the van indicated and took a turning off the motorway. I followed. Within minutes, we were driving down country lanes. At first, the roads were wider, surrounded by dark fields, but soon they began to narrow, with trees pressing in on both sides. The man was taking us into woodland, and it was far thicker even than that on the island. The trees here were so tall that, looking up through the windscreen, only a thin stretch of night sky was visible overhead. It created the strange sensation that I was seeing a black road inverted up there, that a vast distance above there were two tiny vehicles making a mirror journey. The red eyes of the camper van rounded a corner ahead. And when I rounded it a few seconds later, they were gone. I slowed down immediately, a flare of panic cutting through the wooziness. If I lost the van, what would happen to Sarah? The road ahead stretched out into the distance, and there was no way the van had been traveling fast enough to disappear from view so quickly. So where had it gone? I glanced to my left and caught a glimpse of red light flickering between the trees there, and I pulled my father's car to a stop just as I passed a break in the tree line. A dirt trail led away into the forest there. The entrance was thin and overgrown, and the angle was so tight that I had to reverse back and round slightly before driving awkwardly in. The wheels undulated on the ground, and the branches of the trees to either side began thwacking and scratching at the sides of the car. The camper van's red eyes were lost ahead of me now, but the trail snaked along without any turnoffs the vehicle could have taken. I drove carefully, my headlights occasionally picking out the sharp tips of branches where they had been cut away. At some point, the killer had widened this route to make it more accessible. Perhaps he had even carved the whole trail out by hand. It was hard to imagine the act of willpower that must have taken, but this man had willpower, didn't he? I might not know everything about him, but I knew that much. The back of the camper van appeared out of nowhere. I pressed down hard on the brakes, bringing my father's car to a stop only just behind it. My headlights illuminated the dirty metal door in the back of the vehicle. Its engine was silent and all the lights were off. Dust from the trail swirled gently in my headlights. I waited for 30 seconds. Nothing. Okay, I thought. I opened the glove compartment and took out the knife I had picked up from my father's house before leaving. When I turned off the engine, the world fell dark for a moment. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't as pitch black as it should have been. A faint glow was coming from somewhere beyond the camper van. Little dots of light flickered on the trees there. I stepped out of the car, holding the knife casually down by my side, slightly behind my leg. The place we had come to a stop in was a little wider than the trail directly behind me, the tree line a short distance away on both sides. I stood still, listening for a moment. The forest was silent, but the man had brought me here and must have known exactly where I was right now, so there was no point in being quiet. "Sarah," I called loudly, no response. I moved quickly down the passenger side of the camper van, banging on the side once as I went. "Sarah." Nothing. When I reached the cab, I peered into the window. There was nobody inside. Through the dirty glass, I could see the flickering lights from ahead playing over smudges of leather and plastic. As I moved to the front of the vehicle, the source of the illumination became apparent. The trail continued ahead of the camper van, and the path there was lit by strings of white fairy lights that had been draped between the trees on either side. "It's the lights in the trees I remember most," Michael Johnson had said. They seemed so out of place, like a fairy tale. I watched as the tiny bulbs flicked on and off in a steady, repeating pattern. Perhaps they were supposed to create the impression of a magical path in a forest, but there was nothing enchanting about them. They looked more like the kind of decorations a child might encounter at some cheap outdoor Christmas grotto. I turned the knife in my hand. Regardless, the lights created a corridor of sorts, one that it was obvious the man intended for me to follow. But I didn't have to do what he wanted me to. I could get back in my car and reverse out of here, try to find a phone and lead the police to this place. But there was no guarantee that the man would be here when they arrived, or that Sarah would still be alive by then either. The man's voice in my head again. "You're good at running, aren't you?" I moved forward cautiously. Once I was on the path, the lights around me seemed almost viciously bright, the woods behind them deep and black. As the flashes alternated, the lights danced over the trees and the leafy ground. My footsteps crunched softly in the silence. I felt scared, exposed, and vulnerable. And yet something told me that the man wasn't waiting in the trees to ambush me, that he was ahead of me right now in every sense. 30 seconds later, the trail widened out into a more open space. I stopped at the edge. It was a clearing illuminated by a number of larger bulbs embedded in the tops of wooden posts. The light from them cast elongated, cross-shaped shadows onto the land. Cables were spooled everywhere on the ground. I looked to my right and saw the remains of an old, broken-down building that had been almost overtaken by the trees around it. The stonework had collapsed in places, and the panes in the downstairs windows were mostly gone, just a few jagged teeth of glass all but lost in the tangles of grass that were growing out over the sills. The sight of it made me shiver. And when I looked to my left, the feeling got worse. It took a moment for the sight there to resolve itself and make sense. From what I could tell, there was a series of wooden pens and metal cages, and my gaze was drawn to the pen closest to the house. There was somebody in there, a shape on the ground that looked like a human being, lying on their side. Light was glinting on what appeared to be a chain tethering whoever was in there to a wooden post in the earth. I took a faltering step in that direction, glancing around, speaking more quietly now. "Sarah," the shape on the ground responded to the sound of my voice. A head lifted up in the shadows. Even in the darkness, I could tell it was her from the way her hair hung down. She didn't reply, but I didn't know if that was because she was gagged in some way or too badly injured to talk. The thought of that made me want to head across to her, but that was exactly what the man would be expecting me to do, so I fought it down and forced myself to remain where I was, and he was here somewhere. "Dan." The voice came from right behind me, and I turned quickly, raising the knife as I did. I didn't know what I was expecting to see. A monster, perhaps, a man in a mask. But it was just Craig Aspinall, and for a split second that didn't make any sense to me at all. Why was he here? What was that in his hand? And then the side of my head exploded. Oceanoff PDF, com. 35 Dan. John has been drifting, almost unconscious, but hearing his son's name causes him to jerk awake. Where is he? It takes a second to realize that he's crouched in a pen, weak and trembling, his body braced awkwardly against the post. He looks up the farm in time to see Daniel crumple, like a chimney collapsing, one moment upright, the next gone entirely. Dust puffs up into the bleary, crisscross streams of light when his body hits the ground, and then he lies still. John tries to call out Daniel, but he doesn't have the strength left to speak. All he can do is cling to the post and watch as Craig Aspinall stands over Daniel for a moment, looking down at him. John can see enough of the man's face to recognize the rage burning there. Aspinall crouches down beside his son, the blackjack in his hand, and John visualizes him bringing that weapon down on Daniel again and again and do something, but he can't. He has nothing left. All he can do is watch. Aspinall reaches out with his free hand and turns Daniel's head, then peers down into his face. It looks like he says something. But even though John can't make out the words, he has the impression that Aspinall is checking Daniel isn't dead. Please, he thinks, please, please, please. Aspinall nods to himself. He discards the blackjack and picks up something from the ground beside him. John squints, trying to make out what it is, and feels a lurch of horror when he does, a knife glinting briefly in the light for a second. Then Aspinall stands up, his free hand gripping Daniel's wrist, and he begins pulling his body down the compound. Down toward where John is crouching, 3 empty pens between them. John watches helplessly as Aspinall passes the first, dragging Daniel behind him, coming closer. He seems so strong, so effortless. It's horrifying to see his son's body being pulled across the ground like dead weight, but there's a deeper sense of horror too, past the second pen. Because John knows that the 3 of them, Sarah, him, Daniel, are the last remaining victims in Aspinall's chain. And there's only one possible reason why Aspinall needs Daniel to be alive. When he kills John and Sarah, he wants Daniel to be aware of what's happening. He wants him to see and feel every second of it, and past the 3rd pen. Brace yourself, John tells himself. You'll only have one chance. Aspinall reaches the entrance to his pen. John wants to hold his breath, but knows that he'll faint if he does. All he can do is hope, and Aspinall doesn't turn his head. He doesn't care, he doesn't see. He just keeps going, dragging Daniel behind him, focused on the next pen along. John knows there will only be a second before the man sees the ragged hole in the ground where the post once was. Before he realizes the pen is empty, he forces himself to his feet. He only managed to move a little way from his prison before collapsing, and he's so much weaker now, but he tries to gather some last trace of strength inside himself. Stumbles out of the pen, his vision blurry, the farm off-kilter and turning around him. Aspinall is still holding both the knife and Daniel's wrist, staring into the next enclosure, caught in that split second between seeing and understanding that offers John his only chance. Come on, old man, keep going. Aspinall starts to turn and John launches himself at him. Ocean off PDF, calm. 36. I opened my eyes. All I could see was darkness and dusty ground and shadows that stretched out at odd angles. What had happened? Everything was blurry and strange. It reminded me of ducking my head beneath the surface of a swimming pool on sports day. The cheering from the stands suddenly muted and dulled, my heart beat in my ears, and then all that noise returning, incomprehensible for a second, as I broke back up into the air to take a breath. I rolled onto all fours and vomited into the dirt. Broken fragments of memory slotted together in my mind. The farm, Aspinall, Sarah. Panic flared as I remembered where I was and what I was doing here. My right hand was pressed to the ground. I noticed there were shadows playing over it, and then I heard the sound of fighting from beside me to the right. I turned my head. 2 people were wrestling on the ground a bare couple of meters away. At first, that was all I could make out, because their bodies were only half illuminated by the lights, and they were rolling this way and that. Puffs of dust were rising from the ground, and the shadows spilled out like fingers opening and closing against the dirt. One of the men suddenly shouted out in pain, and a moment later the light caught Craig Aspinall's face, now sitting astride the other figure. Aspinall pulled the knife out of wherever it had been stuck in the man beneath him, then raised it and brought it down with a thud into the front of his shoulder. The impact caused the other man to lift his head, and when his face caught the light too, I realized it was my father. Aspinall pulled the knife out and raised it again, his free hand gripping hold of my father's hair, turning his head to hold the target steady. And somehow I moved. It was as much a stumble as anything else, a desperate half fall across the short distance between us, but I managed to loop my left arm under Aspinall's and my right behind his back, joining my hands at the far side of his head, and the momentum took him off my father and sent us both sprawling into the dust on our sides. With my chest against Aspinall's back, I kept my hands gripped tightly together as best I could, then tried to hook my foot over to pin him at the ankles. As we wrestled, the shattered lights of the compound whirled around us. The ground was at my back and then against my elbows with Aspinall underneath me, but then the 2 of us were rolling, his weight on top of me again. I lost track of where the knife was, or if he even still had it. You do not let go, I imagined my father saying. You do not give up. But Aspinall was much stronger than I had expected, fueled by that burning rage inside him, and my own body seemed watery and weak in comparison. I caught a flash of light on the knife and slackened my grip and reached out to grab his wrist, but he moved as I did, squirming out of the loosened hold and catching me hard in the face with an elbow. the world filled with stars again. And then Aspinall was on top of me, lifting the knife up into the night air. There was no time to avoid the blow, but then there was a sickening thud as my father swung the wooden post into Aspinall's head. The strength of the blow knocked Aspinall off me and into the shadows to my side. I rolled over, my father stepping across me, and I watched as he raised the post again before bringing it down in an overhead strike that landed where Aspinall's face must have been. The force of the collision took my father off balance. He stumbled back toward me. I thought he was going to trip, but somehow he gathered himself, corrected the half fall, and ended up kneeling down in the dust next to me. We looked at each other, silence for a moment. And then I realized that from off to the side I could hear Aspinall attempting to breathe through the remains of his face. It was a horrible, sickening noise, and it sounded for all the world like someone was whistling. Oceanoff PDF, com. James, August 2001. James stands up. The man is walking toward him across the compound, approaching him slowly and steadily. There's no need for him to rush because he knows there's nowhere for James to escape to. There never has been. Perhaps it's strange, but James realizes he's not afraid anymore. Until this moment, the man has been a monolith, a demon, a monster. But as he walks toward James now, the lights of the compound are bringing him into sharp relief, and it's clear that he's only ever been a man, average height and build. His face is finally visible now, and the features that James can see there are unremarkable. While he's still whistling his tune, it sounds small and silly now. He might even look pathetic if he wasn't holding the knife. James glances down. All he has are the keys he took from the cellar. They won't save him, but he clenches them between his knuckles anyway. Just give a good account of yourself, he thinks. He's not sure where the voice comes from, but it's right. That's all he can do. Because he is going to die, he understands that clearly. It should have been obvious from the very first moment he was taken on the beach that there wasn't going to be a happy ending. And perhaps a part of him had recognized that all along, and that's why he held on to that little flame inside him. He was always going to lose, but that doesn't mean the man has to win. He is only a few meters away now, but he has his back to the house, which means James can see something that he can't. You know what you have to do. He remembers the old kerosene lamp on the shelf in the cellar, the crumpled box of matches beside it. The man has left the front door open, and over his shoulder, James can see a faint glow coming from inside the house. The first few tendrils of smoke from the fire he started in the basement are already beginning to emerge out into the air above the porch. The man doesn't know it yet, but his storeroom full of dark magic is burning, all his power turning to ash and smoke. And by the time he does realize, it will be too late to rescue any of it. James glances down at the boy beside him. I'm sorry I didn't manage to save us, he thinks, but I tried my best. And as the man finally reaches them, James looks away from him entirely, past the pen and into the woods beyond. His mother is standing between the trees again now, half illuminated by the floodlights, half illuminated by something else. She smiles at him. Are you proud of me? He says, her smile broadens. More than you could ever know, she says. I love you so much. Now close your eyes and come here. Island resident PLEADS guilty to mainland murders Craig Aspinall has today admitted his role in the murders of 5 people. The local handyman, well known in the community, pleaded guilty to the murders of Oliver Hunter, Graham Lloyd, Rose Saunders, Darren Field, and Michael Johnson. All 5 killings occurred between June and September this year. Aspinall, 72, appeared by video link, having previously admitted to additional counts of assault and abduction at an earlier hearing. Sentencing was adjourned until next week, with the judge warning him that he faces a mandatory whole life term. DCI Frank Smith said these were brutal crimes, showing a high degree of sophistication and planning. Craig Aspinall is an exceptionally dangerous man, and I hope that today's events can begin to bring some degree of closure to the families and friends of his victims. Our thoughts are with them. He said, I would like to thank the large team of officers who have worked tirelessly on what has been a complex and challenging investigation. Special credit is due to former Officer John Garvey, whose efforts in helping to solve this case cannot be overstated. DCI Smith declined to comment on reports that further remains had been discovered following Aspinall's arrest, stating only that the investigation remains open. John Garvey was unavailable for comment. Oceanoff PDF, com. 37, a knuckle rapped on the car window. I looked up quickly from the newspaper clipping. The glass was dappled with rain. Beyond that, one of the security guards at the prison was leaning down next to the car, sheltering under an umbrella. I put the window down. Hi, Eric. Hey there, Dr. Garvey. He gestured behind him with his thumb. I buzzed you in at the gate, but I wanted to check. You're not listed on the rota I was given as being at work today. Did someone make a mistake? I looked ahead, out through the windscreen. With its old brick walls and blocky towers, the prison was a forbidding sight at the best of times. Today, the weather made the building look even more washed out and forlorn, a hopeless place, one that was perhaps best left obscured by the rain, assuming you couldn't avoid it altogether. And today I couldn't. No, I said. I'm not on call. I'm here to see someone. He smiled. Just can't stay away, right? I did my best to smile back. Not a patient, I said. Not today. I walked around the perimeter and saw the queue of people waiting at the main entrance. They were all here to visit husbands, friends, loved ones. I'd seen them hundreds of times before in the past, and had always been oddly touched by the everyday sense of humanity their presence here suggested. Whatever the prisoners inside here might have done, they were just human beings. They had connections to ordinary lives that continued outside the prison's walls, and maybe one day they would rejoin them. My own appointment today was very different. After I signed in, I was searched, and then a guard led me down an endless series of corridors, buzzing us through one door after another as he went. Eventually, we stopped outside one without a handle. You ready? He said. Yes. He scanned his card. The door opened. I stepped inside. Craig Aspinall had been brought in before me. He was handcuffed and dressed in prison overalls, seated on the far side of a table in the middle of the room. There was a chair across from him, and I walked over and sat down. The door closed behind me. Silence for a moment as we stared at each other. Despite everything he had done, I found it almost painful to look at him. I still remembered how he had seemed on the island, sun-worn and strong, a man who walked the trails and fixed things that other people had broken. But that man was gone now. His skin was pale, and the operations he'd undergone while awaiting trial had only been half successful. The surgeons had managed to reattach his lower jaw, but it remained misaligned, and his face below the nose was a mess of angry scar tissue. As a consequence of his injuries, it had been difficult for him to eat solid food, and his body appeared thin and weak beneath the overalls. But appearances could be deceptive, because the rage that I knew consumed him inside was still burning softly in his eyes. If anything, he probably hated me even more now than he had before, and perhaps I should have hated him in return, but I didn't. I was detached, I was calm. There was no such thing as monsters. Aspinall was only a man. He was the product of his environment and experiences, the focal point of the damage done to him and the damage he had passed on to others because of it. And I knew a lot more about that damage now. I knew about the abusive childhood he had suffered while growing up on the island, common to many men his age there, and I knew that the demons he'd acquired had followed him when he escaped in his early 20s. I knew about his history of drug use and petty criminality after he moved to the mainland, the violence, the periods of incarceration as his offenses gathered momentum and became more serious. I knew a lot less about his relationship with Abigail Palmer, but enough to understand that it had been a fractured and volatile one. My father told me that when he first found Abigail's file, it had given him the impression of a drowning woman who kept coming up for air. Having read it since, I agreed with him. And while I imagined Craig Aspinall believed he had loved her in his own way, I was equally sure that he had been one of the things that kept emerging from the depths to pull her down again. Had he been James's father? That wasn't clear. No father's name was recorded on the birth certificate, but I suspected so. Regardless, he had been an intermittent presence in the boy's early life, sometimes there, more often not. At the time of James's disappearance, Aspinall had been estranged from both of them, beginning a 5-year sentence for robbery and assault. By all accounts, he had been determined to turn his life around. Perhaps he had even imagined there might be a family waiting for him outside when he did. But given he had no official connection to Abigail and James, he hadn't been contacted when James drowned or when Abigail took her life later that year. He only learned of both events upon his release, by which point the media coverage of the Pied Piper was long over. In the meantime, his father had died. Aspinall inherited a ramshackle house on the island. His childhood home probably had monsters in every room, ghosts in all the shadows, but there was nowhere else for him to go by then. I remembered the look of bitterness on his face when I'd spoken to him while collecting my father's car. That's the thing about this island, right? You think you've got away, but the place keeps dragging you back. Did you bring it? He asked me now. The injuries made it as difficult for him to speak as they did for him to eat. But even though I had to concentrate, I would have understood what he was asking regardless. The need in his body language was clear. He was like an addict. As much as he hated me, he was willing to endure my presence here in order to get what he wanted. Did you bring it? I glanced down at the folder in my lap. We'll get to that, Craig, but there are a couple of questions I want to ask you first, and then maybe I can help you. I took the first item out of my folder, my old, battered copy of The Man Made of Smoke by Terence O'Hare. It felt strange to touch it again after all these years. I ran my fingers down the edge of its weathered and faded pages, and then across a cover that was now only barely attached. The book was second-hand in every way. I had spent so much time reading it when I was younger, lost for a while in the trauma it contained. When I left it behind me, I had passed it on to my father without realizing. I thumbed through it now, recognizing the passages I had underlined and the notes I had made in the margins. My father had added his own annotations and asterisks too, a different hand and a different pen, and then finally and again, without realizing, he had passed it on to someone else. "That's mine," Aspinall said. "Where did you get it?" "You know where." I supposed that was answer enough. My father had pursued his investigation over the years, as obsessed in his own way as I had been, and when he finally solved it, he had made a choice. The world had moved on, he decided, and there was nothing to be gained from unearthing the past. It was better to draw a line and move on. His first visit to Abigail Palmer's grave had been on what would have been James's birthday, and he had left the book there, where Aspinall must have found it upon his own yearly visit. "Did you see him at the grave?" I asked. "My father," he nodded, "every year." I watched him. I flicked through the book to the photographs in the middle, past the pictures of Sean Loughlin, Paul Deacon, and Charlie French, to the pages dedicated to Robbie Garforth, the portrait that had been taken at his school, the photograph I had found at the rest area, and the sketch I had helped the police to draw, which, because of my persistence back then, had turned out to be an almost perfect likeness of James Palmer. "And is this when you realized?" I said. He nodded again. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Don't you fucking dare apologize." Before I had a chance to react, Aspinall was out of his seat. He smashed his hands down on the table and stared across at me, the hatred and rage burning brightly in his eyes now. "It's your fault that he's dead." Equally quickly, the door opened behind me and I sensed a guard stepping into the room, but I didn't turn around. I just stared back at Aspinall and held up my hand as a signal to the man behind me. "It's okay." After a moment, Aspinall settled back down in his chair, breathing heavily as much as he could manage. Then I heard the sound of the guard retreating and the door closing again. I looked down at the book. "It's your fault that he's dead." I had spent so long believing that. At first, I had allowed the guilt to consume and suffocate me, and then, in the years afterward, I had forced myself to feel far too little of anything. It wasn't that I had locked what happened away behind a door. It was more like it had been in the room with me ever since, filling the air around me, and I had spent my whole life too afraid to breathe in. What a waste. Because looking back now, I realized how much compassion I felt for the boy I had been. The encounter with the Pied Piper had happened at the worst possible time for me, no longer a child, allowed to be scared of monsters, not yet a man, capable of taking responsibility. I remembered thinking of the rest area as a liminal space, a crossing over spot between different worlds, but the truth is that I had been in one of those that entire summer, and I could forgive myself for that. "I'm not apologizing, Craig," I said, "because it's not my fault." I said that I was sorry, and that's not the same thing. He stared at me for a few seconds, still breathing heavily. "But you are right," I told him. "This belongs to you now." I put the book on the table and slid it across to him. He picked it up quickly and began thumbing through its pages as best he could, but I knew that it wasn't the book he was interested in so much as what he had kept in it, and when he didn't find it, he looked up at me. "Where is it?" "Maybe we'll get to that. There's something else I want to know first." I leaned forward. "I know that you worked on your farm for months," I said. "It was important to you to duplicate what you imagined in your mind's eye." "Yes, because it had to be right." "But what interests me more," I said, "is how you found that location to begin with. In your statement, you said you spent a lot of your free time driving along country roads, searching for somewhere. You'd stop in a place and check, and it wouldn't feel right, so you'd move on again. Over and over again, 3 years of this," he nodded. I thought about the newspaper article I'd read in the car. DCI Smith declined to comment on reports that further remains had been discovered following Aspinall's arrest. When the police arrived at the compound that night, the whole area had been immediately cordoned off. The searches they made were thorough and comprehensive. And on the third day, while investigating a patch of land in one of the pens, they found 4 sets of human remains buried in the ground there. Initial examination of the bones recovered suggested that they belonged to males between the ages of 5 and 15, and that the bodies had been there for a long time, possibly decades. The information had yet to be released to the public, but I knew that recent DNA tests had finally established the identities of all 4 boys: Sean Loughlin, Paul Deacon, Charlie French, and James Palmer. The farm had obviously been abandoned and derelict for years before Aspinall chanced upon it, and the precise chain of ownership was murky and unclear. The most recent entry on the land registry suggested it belonged to a man named William Mac Guyer, who had inherited it from his father. But that had been many years ago, and there were no other surviving records of Mac Guyer. There were no photographs of the man, no available DNA. Beyond the farm and the bodies left there, he appeared to have left no trace on the world at all. It might never be proved beyond doubt that he was the Pied Piper, but it seemed likely to me. Never a monster at all, just a man, but none of that explained what had led Aspinall there. Years of searching, I said. What happened on the day you found it? He didn't reply. Craig, I prompted. Nothing. I stood up, making it clear I was going to leave. I heard him. And then I sat back down again slowly. Heard who? I said. My boy. I waited. It was like I was lost that day, he said. I was driving down all these roads and had no idea where I was. It was the middle of nowhere, everything overgrown. I was looking for him, but I was ready to give up, and then I heard him calling out to me. It was only for a second, but his voice was clear as day. He was shouting out for help. That's when I saw the path in the trees, which you followed. I did, Aspinall nodded, and when I got there it felt like I was home. As I looked at him now, I saw that the rage had faded from his eyes. He seemed helpless, haunted, and for a moment I could see the little boy in him. His expression reminded me of James Palmer's that day at the rest area. Did you bring it? He said quietly, yes. I reached into my file and produced a piece of paper. The best I could offer Aspinall was a color photocopy. The original had been discovered in his house, tucked away inside the man made of smoke, but it was something that Aspinall had kept and lived with for far longer than he'd had the book. I slid it over the table to him. It was a letter that he had received many years ago during that final spell in prison. As he rested his hands on it now, they obscured most of the page, but I could see the awkward handwriting at the top. To Dad. The picture that James Palmer had drawn for his father was visible at the bottom. 3 stick figures standing side by side. The smallest one was holding what looked like an orange smudge. And beside the 3 of them, a Christmas tree, with little colored fairy lights dotted everywhere in the branches. Oceanoff PDF, com. 38. Despite my best intentions, I was late. I parked outside the gates of the cemetery and then walked quickly through its streets, following the directions my father had given to me. In an ideal world, I would have met him at the entrance, and we would have walked in together, but in some ways it was comforting to arrive after the fact. Because as I reached the grave and saw my father standing there alone, it was possible to imagine that a throng of people had been here a few minutes ago, and had dispersed and drifted away after the short ceremony was over. In reality, it would just have been my father, but it was nice to be able to pretend that there had been a crowd. As he heard my footsteps, he turned a little awkwardly, holding his arm against his body. He was still recovering from the wounds Aspinall inflicted on him that night, to the extent that he ever would. His arm had been out of the sling for a few months now, but he hadn't regained anything close to full movement, and the doctors had warned him that he might not. The past few months had aged him more than it felt like they should have. Part of that was down to an inability to exercise, which I knew had frustrated him beyond words. Certainly, he hadn't been able to hit anything all this time. But it was also difficult to escape the feeling that his whole life had been spent fighting, enduring, carrying on, and that now, finally, he was allowing himself to relax a little. While he appeared older, he also looked happier. I'm sorry I'm late, I said. That's okay, he smiled. You got here in the end. I looked down at the grave in front of us. Most of the plots in this part of the cemetery were old, the grass bedraggled and barely tended, the headstones simple and cheap. For many years, this grave had been identical to its neighbors. But today, it was a rectangle of freshly turned brown earth. The plain headstone that marked the plot previously had been replaced by a new one, commissioned and paid for by my father and me, made of white marble that glinted in the winter sun. I read the inscription there now. Abigail Palmer, 6 March 1970, August 1998, James Palmer, 9 June 1986, August 2001, WEC. We care. Was the ceremony suitably delightful? I said. No, the priest said far too many words. I detected a familiar grumble of disapproval in his voice. My father had never had much time for the trappings of organized religion, but his tone mellowed slightly when he spoke again. "But yes, it was nice," he said. "Have you brought it?" "Of course I have." I walked around the side of the grave and put the stuffed toy lion down in front of the headstone. It wasn't the same one that was found at the beach after James Palmer went missing, but there was a photograph of that in the coroner's file, and I'd done my best to source the closest possible substitute I could find. After a moment, my father looked at me. "Are you still coming back to the island tonight?" "Yes," I frowned slightly. "I mean, as long as that's okay." He turned away again. "Of course it is, I was just checking." "Then yes," I said, "of course I am." We stood there in silence for a time, both of us absorbed by our own memories and feelings. But the breeze was cold, and after a while my father began shivering. I was about to suggest that we leave when I realized that he was waiting me out without wanting to say so, that he wanted a moment here by himself for reasons of his own. "See you back at the car," I suggested. "You will." I headed off, but I turned back as I reached the corner, and I saw that my father was still standing there, lost in thought. But rather than looking at the grave like I expected, he was staring at a small copse of trees in the distance. And because it was still so unpredictable what he could do with his arm, what happened next might have been my imagination, but I thought he raised his hand slightly. When we get back home, my father makes us dinner, and we share a bottle of red wine while we eat. Then I go up to the attic to get changed. As I'm putting on a jumper, I hear his footsteps on the stairs, and then he knocks on the door. "It's open," I say. He pokes his head round. "Want to sit out back for a bit?" he says. "I can put the heater on." I brush the front of my jumper down. Normally I would say yes, I tell him, but I think I might actually head out for a few hours if that's okay. "Of course, just don't wake me up if you get back late." "I won't, and say hello for me." I resist the instinct to look at him. "I've no idea what you're talking about," I say. "Old man, it's a cold, clear night with no clouds to hide the prickling of stars in the sky." My breath steams in front of me beneath the amber streetlights as I walk. The seafront by the ferry terminal is brightly lit and busy for out of season, but the world grows quieter and darker as I follow the coastal road around. I see the bar up ahead and hear her voice at the same time. The place is almost empty, just the same handful of elderly regulars as the first time I came in. I grab a beer and then sit quietly at the back, watching as Sarah finishes up the song. She's lost in the moment, pitch perfect, the disco ball turning slowly above her. She looks like a star. There's a little applause at the end, which I join in with as she gives an ostentatious bow. A moment later, she looks down the bar and notices me sitting there. We hold each other's gaze for a couple of seconds, and then she walks over. In the time it takes her to reach my table, a number of things go through my head. The most immediate is that I can't remember the last time I was as nervous as I am right now, when I've ever felt this vulnerable and exposed, or when my heart was beating quite so hard. "Hey there, stranger," she says. "Hey there." And then I release a breath I've been holding for so very long. "I was thinking about that duet," I say. "Oceanoff PDF, com." Acknowledgements. Thank you so much to Joel Richardson and Ryan Doherty for their patience, expertise, and support. As always, this book is so much better because of your editorial advice and encouragement. And a massive thank you for all those things to my wonderful agent, Sandra Sawicka, and to Lee Middleton and everyone else at Marjack. I also have to thank a number of other people who have helped in various ways along this book's long road to publication. Susie Bruston, Rachel Chu, Lucy Beresford Knox, Rihanna Dixon, Annabelle Hindenlang, Grace Long, James Novin, Emily Radel, Rebecca Ritchie, Frances Sayers, and Faith Tomlin. Thank you to Will Stihel for a beautiful US cover, and also to Lauren Wakefield for an equally gorgeous UK cover. Thank you to Sarah Day and Justine Gardner. After so many drafts, it becomes hard to see the forest for the trees, and I'm indebted to you both for pointing out the tangles in the undergrowth, and I'm painfully aware that this list is incomplete. As with every novel, there will be people who contributed without my knowing, and I am grateful to every single one of you. The crime fiction community is famous for being open and welcoming, and I've been lucky to have the friendship and support of so many writers along the way. Thank you all for the advice and the laughter, with a special mention to Colin Scott on both counts. Thanks are also due to all the booksellers, librarians, book groups, event organizers, podcasters, and reviewers who have been so kind to me over the years. And perhaps most important of all, thank you to the readers who have enjoyed the previous novels. I really hope you like this one too. Finally, a huge thank you to my family. Lynn and Zach, thank you putting up with me. This one is dedicated to you both with gratitude and love. They all are. Oceanoff PDF.com. Founded in 2017, Celadon Books, a division of Macmillan Publishers, publishes a highly curated list of 20 to 25 new titles a year. The list of both fiction and nonfiction is eclectic and focuses on publishing commercial and literary books and discovering and nurturing talent. Oceanoffpdf.com. Oceanoffpdf.com. Also by Alex North, The Angel Maker, The Shadows, The Whisper Man. Oceanoffpdf.com. About the author. Alex North is the internationally best-selling author of The Angel Maker, The Shadows, and The Whisper Man. He lives in Leeds, England with his wife and son, and is a British crime writer who has previously published under another name. You can sign up for email updates here. Oceanoffpdf.com. Oceanoffpdf.com. Contents: title page, copyright notice, dedication, part 1. Denial, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, Chapter 6, Chapter 7, James, Part 2. Anger, Chapter 8, Chapter 9, Chapter 10, Chapter 11, Chapter 12, Chapter 13, Chapter 14, Chapter 15, James, Part 3. Bargaining, Chapter 16, Chapter 17, Chapter 18. Chapter 19, Chapter 20, Chapter 21, Chapter 22, James, Part 4. Despair, Chapter 23, Chapter 24, Chapter 25, Chapter 26, Chapter 27, Chapter 28, Chapter 29, James, Chapter 30, Chapter 31, Part 5. Acceptance, Chapter 32, Chapter 33, Chapter 34, Chapter 35, Chapter 36, James, Chapter 37, Chapter 38. Acknowledgements, also by Alex North, about the author. Copyright Oceanoffpdf.com. This is a work of fiction. All of the characters, organizations, and events portrayed in this novel are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. The Man Made of Smoke. Copyright 2025 by Alex North. All rights reserved. For information, address Celadon Books, a division of Macmillan Publishers, 120 Broadway, New York, NY 10271. www.celadonbooks.com. Cover design by Will Steele. The Library of Congress has cataloged the print edition as follows. Names: North, Alex, 1976. Author. Title: The Man Made of Smoke, a novel / Alex North. Description: First edition, New York, Celadon Books, 2025. Identifiers: LCCN 2,024,048,784, ISBN 9,781,250,757,890, hardcover. ISBN 9,781,250,757,913, ebook. Subjects: LCGFT, thrillers, fiction, novels. Classification: LCCPR 6113. 085M36 2025, DDC 823, DC 23//20,241,022, LC record available at https://lccn. Lock, gov/2,024,048,784. EISBN 9,781,250,757,913. The publisher of this book does not authorize the use or reproduction of any part of this book in any manner for the purpose of training artificial intelligence technologies or systems. The publisher of this book expressly reserves this book from the text and data mining exception in accordance with Article 4 of the European Union Digital Single Market Directive 2019/790. Our ebooks may be purchased in bulk for promotional, educational, or business use. Please contact your local bookseller or the Macmillan Corporate and Premium Sales Department at 1-800-221-7945, extension 5442, or by email at macmillanspecialmarkets@macmillan.com. First edition, 2025, Oceanoffpdf.com.